Madam President, allow me at the outset to thank the Presidency of the Council for holding this meeting at such a critical and dangerous juncture, and to thank Denmark for the meeting held by the Security Council at ministerial level on food under fire yesterday, which placed emphasis on the humanitarian situation, among other issues, in the Gaza Strip. Allow me also to thank the briefers for their contributions. Madam President, the ICJ concluded in no uncertain terms that, and I quote, "The violations by Israel of the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force and of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination have a direct impact on the legality of the continued presence of Israel as an occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory." End of quotation. In addition, that, and I quote, "the sustained abuse by Israel of its position as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the occupied Palestinian territory and continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory unlawful." End of quotation. Annexation has long been underway, but Israel has now crossed the Rubicon when it comes to full-fledged, full-blown annexation with the release of the tenders for E1 plan. The Israeli government stated clearly that its goal in issuing these tenders was the destruction of the Palestinian state and the triumph of the settler state. This is in parallel with the settlers' violence terrorizing the Palestinian population that the Israeli government has helped unleashed, is refusing to control, and continues to effectively support. They do not care that annexation kills any prospect for peace in our region. This is indeed their objective, as their appetite for colonial conquest is far greater than their concern for their own people. They want to derail the efforts of President Trump and the implementation of the comprehensive plan, which encompasses the clearly affirmed policy of President Trump rejecting annexation, while Palestine, the region, and other international partners are mobilizing to consolidate the ceasefire in Gaza and to implement the resolutions of this council in this regard. Their objectives are clear. They are ideological and electoral and reflective of an illusion that the Palestine question can be addressed by the annihilation of our national project and the destruction of our state and our people. This is madness, and this strategy of perpetual war and denial of our rights has failed over and over again, but comes with a heavy and unbearable human toll. Madam President, Israel's obligations are clear as its disregard for them. Israel's crimes committed against our people and the grave breaches of international law are among the best documented in history. I repeat, among the best documented in history, and you all know that. So I am here to speak of the obligations of the rest of the international community in view of Israel's persistence in committing these breaches. Allow me to start by thanking all the countries and their leaders who have taken a clear and unequivocal stance following the release of the E1 tenders in condemning the E1 plan and the settlement regime and calling to reverse all these illegal unilateral steps. We call on all states to abide by their obligations under international law as clarified by the ICJ. The ICJ spelled out clearly the obligations of states as they pertain to non-recognition, distinction, non-assistance, and accountability, as well as to supporting the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Here they are, these obligations. Member states are under an obligation not to recognize any changes in the physical character or demographic composition, institutional structure, or status of the territory occupied by Israel on 5th of June of 1967, including East Jerusalem, except as agreed by the parties through negotiations, and to distinguish in their dealings with Israel between the territory of the State of Israel and the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. This obligation of distinction encompasses the obligation to abstain from treaty relations with Israel in all cases in which it purports to act on behalf of the occupied Palestinian territory or a part thereof. To abstain from entering into economic or trade dealings with Israel concerning the occupied Palestinian territory or parts thereof which may entrench its unlawful presence in the territory. To abstain in the establishment and maintenance of diplomatic missions in Israel from any recognition of its illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, and to take steps to prevent trade or investment relations that assist in the maintenance of the illegal situation created by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. The steps relating to ending all trade with settlements are of critical importance, as the settlements economy represents $30 billion a year and is built on the theft of our land and resources, not only the taxation money that they steal from us. Let us also be critical. Let us also be crystal clear that these steps include taking action against businesses and financial institutions, including banks, that contribute to the illegal settlement enterprise, including in the context of the E1 tenders. All legal avenues must be used to hold these businesses and financial institutions accountable and to ensure they withdraw and, when relevant, pay reparations as well as punitive fees for their actions. The court also underlined that, and I quote, all states are under an obligation, all states are under obligation not to recognize as legal the situation arising from the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. They are also under an obligation not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by Israel's illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. End of quotation. In addition, and I quote, it is for all states, while respecting the Charter of the United Nations and international law, to ensure that any impediment resulting from the illegal presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory to the exercise of the Palestinian people of its right to self-determination is brought to an end, end of quotation, and further to continue to ensure compliance by Israel with international humanitarian law as embodied in the 4th Geneva Convention, end of quotation. Madam President, annexation is an attack against our sovereignty and territorial integrity. I repeat, annexation is an attack against our sovereignty and territorial integrity. It is an act of war against our state and our people. It is the ultimate breach of the UN Charter's purposes and principles. It must be stopped. This Council has adopted numerous resolutions in support of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, including independent statehood, and condemning and considering illegal and invalid all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character, and status of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem. These resolutions must be fully implemented. The New York Declaration reiterated this strong opposition to all illegal actions that undermine the viability of the two-state solution, including settlement activities, and expressed the commitment by states to taking concrete measures. Food under fire yesterday, which placed emphasis on the humanitarian situation, among other issues, in the Gaza Strip. Allow me also to thank the briefers for their contributions. Madam President, the ICJ concluded in no uncertain terms that, and I quote, the violations by Israel of the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force and of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination have a direct impact on the legality of the continued presence of Israel as an occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory, end of quotation. In addition, that, and I quote, the sustained abuse by Israel of its position as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the occupied Palestinian territory and continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory unlawful. End of quotation. Annexation has long been underway, but Israel has now crossed the Rubicon when it comes to full-fledged, full-blown annexation with the release of the tenders for E1 plan. The Israeli government stated clearly that its goal in issuing these tenders was the destruction of the Palestinian state and the triumph of the settler state. This is in parallel with the settlers' violence terrorizing the Palestinian population that the Israeli government has helped unleashed, is refusing to control, and continues to effectively support. They do not care that annexation kills any prospect for peace in our region. This is indeed their objective, as their appetite for colonial conquest is far greater than their concern for their own people. They want to derail the efforts of President Trump and the implementation of the comprehensive plan, which encompasses the clearly affirmed policy of President Trump rejecting annexation, while Palestine, the region, and other international partners are mobilizing to consolidate the ceasefire in Gaza and to implement the resolutions of this Council in this regard. Their objectives are clear. They are ideological and electoral and reflective of an illusion that the Palestine question can be addressed by the annihilation of our national project and the destruction of our state and our people. This is madness, and this strategy of perpetual war and denial of our rights has failed over and over again, but comes with a heavy and unbearable human toll. Madam President, Israel's obligations are clear as its disregard for them. Israel's crimes committed against our people and the grave breaches of international law are among the best documented in history. I repeat, among the best documented in history, and you all know that. So I am here to speak of the obligations of the rest of the international community in view of Israel's persistence in committing these breaches. Allow me to start by thanking all the countries and their leaders who have taken a clear and unequivocal stance following the release of the E1 tenders in condemning the E1 plan and the settlement regime and calling to reverse all these illegal unilateral steps. We call on all states to abide by their obligations under international law as clarified by the ICJ. The ICJ spelled out clearly the obligations of states as they pertain to non-recognition, distinction, non-assistance, and accountability, as well as to supporting the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Here they are, these obligations. Member states are under an obligation not to recognize any changes in the physical character or demographic composition, institutional structure, or status of the territory occupied by Israel on 5th of June of 1967, including East Jerusalem, except as agreed by the parties through negotiations and to distinguish in their dealings with Israel between the territory of the State of Israel and the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. This obligation of distinction encompasses the obligation to abstain from treaty relations with Israel in all cases in which it purports to act on behalf of the occupied Palestinian territory or a part thereof. To abstain from entering into economic or trade dealings with Israel concerning the occupied Palestinian territory or parts thereof which may entrench its unlawful presence in the territory. To abstain in the establishment and maintenance of diplomatic missions in Israel from any recognition of its illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, and to take steps to prevent trade or investment relations that assist in the maintenance of the illegal situation created by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. The steps relating to ending all trade with settlements are of critical importance, as the settlements economy represents $30 billion a year and is built on the theft of our land and resources, not only the taxation money that they steal from us. Let us also be critical Let us also be crystal clear that these steps include taking action against businesses and financial institutions, including banks, that contribute to the illegal settlement enterprise, including in the context of the E1 tenders. All legal avenues must be used to hold these businesses and financial institutions accountable and to ensure they withdraw and, when relevant, pay reparations as well as punitive fees for their actions. The court also underlined that, and I quote, all states are under an obligation, all states are under obligation not to recognize as legal the situation arising from the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. They are also under an obligation not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by Israel's illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. End of quotation. In addition, and I quote, it is for all states, while respecting the Charter of the United Nations and international law, to ensure that any impediment resulting from the illegal presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory to the exercise of the Palestinian people of its right to self-determination is brought to an end. End of quotation. And further, to continue, to ensure compliance by Israel with international humanitarian law as embodied in the Fourth Geneva Convention. End of quotation. Madam President, annexation is an attack against our sovereignty and territorial integrity. I repeat, annexation is an attack against our sovereignty and territorial integrity. It is an act of war against our state and our people. It is the ultimate breach of the UN Charter's purposes and principles. It must be stopped. This Council has adopted numerous resolutions in support of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, including independent statehood, and condemning and considering illegal and invalid all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character, and status of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem. These resolutions must be fully implemented. The New York Declaration reiterated this strong opposition to all illegal actions that undermine the viability of the two-state solution, including settlement activities, and expressed the commitment by states to taking concrete measures. I repeat, taking concrete measures in accordance with international law and in line with the relevant UN resolutions and the 19th of July 2024 advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. These commitments will help realize the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and to counter the illegal settlement policy in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and policies and threats of forcible displacement and annexation. Such concrete measures are now of the utmost necessity and urgency. Madam President, the attack on the UN, notably UNRWA, aims at facilitating such forcible displacement of our people and annexation of our land. The storming of UNRWA's Kalandia Training Center, the raising of the Israeli flag on UN premises again, and the childish yet dangerous video of Ben-Gvir in military attire behind the desk of the director of the center constitute breaches of UN Charter and of the inviolability of UN premises as stated by the ICJ. They are part of a pattern to destroy UNRWA in the hope of liquidating the question of Palestine refugees. If such attacks against the UN and its personnel are tolerated in occupied Palestine, including occupied East Jerusalem, then we are undermining the protection of the UN and its personnel everywhere around the world. Such actions must not only be condemned, we must collectively fight back, stop them, not to allow them to happen. I just want to note that this Israeli government has dedicated itself to deploying their so-called might against those who cannot fight back, bombing civilians, attacking communities, abusing prisoners, killing UN and humanitarian personnel, and parading in UN premises. International law was built to protect the most vulnerable, and the world is failing them in Palestine and failing those trying to help them, UN personnel and humanitarians. You've listened to Ms. Rayburn's testimony and briefing. This arrogance by Israel is fueled by a deep-seated sense of impunity, a certainty that they will not be held to account. Defeating this certainty is indispensable to putting an end to these horrific actions. Madam President, nowhere in this impunity more glaring than in the Gaza Strip, where the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians and national and international UN and humanitarian personnel and crimes against an entire civilian population have led to no one being held accountable. Israeli investigations and Israeli courts are designed to foster and ensure such impunity, not to deliver justice. This is clear in all the investigations launched so far by Israel. While IHL stipulates that the occupying power has an obligation to ensure the protection of the people under its occupation, it is evident in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, that Israel not only fails to ensure such protection, the civilian population under its occupation is its primary target as part of its policy of destruction and displacement of our people. The Palestinian people must be afforded, without delay, international protection until such time as their sovereign and independent state is able to protect them. I repeat, the Palestinian people must be afforded, without delay, international protection until such time as their sovereign and independent state is able to protect them. Madam President, the Middle East is not condemned to perpetual war. It is our collective policies that determine its future, and our ability to stop the policies that entrench occupation and fuel war and violence, and to pursue policies that allow for liberty, sovereignty, and peace to prevail, will determine how the Middle East will look for decades to come. We believe in a Middle East of sovereign states enjoying shared peace, shared security, and shared prosperity. We must not allow anyone to deprive the peoples of our region of such a prospect. We must act resolutely now, or the horrors we have seen so far will only be a prelude for more horrors to come. A different future is possible if we act together today. I thank you very much, Madam President.
And I thank the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Madam President, I'd like to begin by thanking today's briefers. It has been 5 years since I last addressed the Security Council. I am proud to be back representing Israel at the United Nations and to address this council today. In one of my last speeches here, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, I gave this council a warning. I warned that Iran was using global attention on COVID to advance its dangerous agenda. I warned about Iran's nuclear ambitions, its advanced missiles production, and its support for terrorist proxies throughout the Middle East: Hamas, the Houthis, the Shia militias in Iraq, and Hezbollah. I warned about Hezbollah's growing presence in southern Lebanon, including its terror tunnel and its 150,000 missiles and rockets aimed at Israeli civilians, the majority of which were supplied and financed by Iran. And I warned that these threats would not disappear simply because the international community choose to look elsewhere. Madam President, when I addressed this council in 2021, I also warned of Hamas's military buildup in Gaza and of its deliberate strategy of hiding behind Gazan civilians while targeting Israeli civilians, embedding its military infrastructure in schools, hospitals, mosques, and residential areas. Regrettably, for years, this council could not bring itself to condemn Hamas by name, not when it fired rockets at Israeli civilians from within densely populated areas in Gaza, and not even after the atrocities of October 7th. The international community ignored Hamas's terrorist activities, just as it ignores Hezbollah's. That silence did not restrain these terrorist organizations. It emboldened them. Madam President, the civilians of Gaza are not Israel's enemy. Our conflict is with Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organization that must be disarmed. It must cease governing the people of Gaza and terrorizing Israel, as well as its own people. Today, we have an opportunity to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. Israel is committed to US President Donald Trump's 20-point plan to end the Gaza conflict, endorsed by this Council in Security Council Resolution 2803. But the plan cannot succeed while Hamas remains armed. Disarmament must come first. Hamas and its weapons must be fully dismantled, its terrorist infrastructure destroyed, and its ability to rearm eliminated, as was agreed upon in the 20-point plan. Israel is working closely with the United States and the Board of Peace to achieve this. Madam President, earlier this month, during a meeting of Prime Minister Netanyahu with Jared Kushner and Nikolai Mladenov in Jerusalem, it was agreed to establish 2 working groups. One, to advance the prompt disarmament of Hamas and demilitarization of Gaza, to be completed before reconstruction begins. And another, to address urgent public health needs, including sanitation and clean water, affecting both Gaza and Israel. That second working group reflects Israel's continued commitment to help facilitate the improvement of humanitarian conditions in Gaza. Since the ceasefire began, some 600 trucks per day have carried approximately 2 million tons of food into Gaza, including an additional 200,000 tons since the Council's last monthly meeting. These quantities significantly exceed every benchmark for humanitarian food requirements published by the World Food Programme for Gaza. In the same period, more than 21,000 tons of medical equipment have entered Gaza. Last week alone, some 2,000 tons of food supplies, 200 tons of shelter material, 200 tons of water, sanitation, and hygiene supplies, and 35 tons of medical equipment entered the Strip. We are also working with the international community, UNDP and UNICEF, to prepare for the coming winter. This means improving the water and sanitation situation, expanding sewage treatment, addressing waste accumulation, and facilitating the entry of additional shelter material. We thank Germany for donating 2 truck scanners. Each is capable of screening more than 100 trucks per day. One had already been installed at the Erez crossing, enabling it to open as an additional entry point for goods in September, alongside the Kerem Shalom crossing. This will significantly expand humanitarian aid capacity. Nearly a year into the ceasefire, the humanitarian trajectory is improving, and Israel will continue working with its partners to improve conditions further. Madam President, humanitarian assistance is important, but it cannot deliver security or a sustainable future for Gaza. Aid alone is no substitute for what must ultimately be done. Hamas and other terrorist organizations must be disarmed so that Gazans can rebuild their lives and have a future free from its control. We should not be fooled by Hamas's words. Hamas must be judged by its actions. While it claims to be willing to disarm, the reality on the ground tells a different story. Since the ceasefire began, Hamas has violated the 20-point line hundreds of times and continued to rebuild its terrorist capacities. Hamas is tightening its grip on Gaza. In early August, Israel dismantled 5 Hamas weapon facilities in Gaza containing rifles, explosives, anti-tank launchers, and other military equipment, including one near a hospital in Deir el-Balach. Just this past Sunday, another weapons manufacturing site was found near an aid distribution center, and 2 weapon storage facilities were found inside mosques, further evidence of Hamas embedding its terrorist infrastructure among civilians, as it has done before and after October 7th. And now, we have new evidence that Hamas is turning against its own people. Israeli intelligence confirmed that Hamas is using Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis for interrogations, torture, and extortion, exploiting a place meant to heal Gazans to intimidate them instead. This is Hamas in action, rebuilding its capabilities, exploiting civilian infrastructure, and using fear to maintain control. That is why Hamas's disarmament cannot rest on promises. It must be complete, verifiable, and irreversible. Madam President, Israel knows what happens when disarmament exists only on paper. We learned the lesson in Lebanon. Resolution 1701 was supposed to ensure the disarmament of Hezbollah and prevent another war. Instead, Hezbollah rearmed. They built an extensive military and tunnel infrastructure, including within civilian areas along Israel's border. With Iranian weapons, funding, and training, Hezbollah grew into an even greater threat. Madam President, Israel has no territorial ambition in Lebanon. We want a secure border and a Lebanon governed by its own institutions, not dominated by an Iranian proxy terrorist organization. Far more unites Israel and Lebanon than divides us. With US facilitation, Israel has engaged directly with the Lebanese government, culminating in a framework agreement signed in Washington, D.C. in June. This dialogue offers a real opportunity to turn the page and open a new chapter of stability. But that opportunity requires Hezbollah to be dismantled and Iran's grip on Lebanon to be broken. Israel remains committed to the ceasefire arrangement, but we will defend our citizens and act against imminent threats. Any further steps must be based on performance on the ground, ensuring that areas from which Israel withdraws remain free of Hezbollah and its military infrastructure. Hezbollah is the only force standing in the way of peace and prosperity in Lebanon. Madam President, We heard many speakers today refer to Kafr Aqib, which speakers here referred to as UNRWA Kalandia Center, including false claims that Israel is acting against the United Nations. Having been personally involved in this issue for several years now, I would like to clarify the facts. Kafr Aqib is a densely populated Arab neighborhood in Jerusalem facing a severe shortage of land for much-needed local educational facilities. Currently, approximately 2,000 local Arab students, including children with special needs, must commute long distances to reach schools elsewhere in the city. For decades, UNRWA has walled off approximately 90 dunam of land in that neighborhood, despite holding no property right over it. Lawfully owned by the Jewish National Fund since 1937, the property was allocated to the Jerusalem municipality for educational facilities serving the Arab children of Kafr Aqib. In 2022 and 2023, I personally participated in meetings with the former UNRWA Commissioner General to seek an arrangement that would allow a school to be built on this site. And I'll be happy to share more information later with interested colleagues. Regrettably, UNRWA rejected the request amid political pressure from local employees opposed to cooperation with Israel. Sadly, this is not surprising. The October 7th massacre exposed Hamas's infiltration within UNRWA, including the involvement of UNRWA's employees in the attacks. Yesterday, after trying to find a solution for years, the municipality took possession of the compound to open a school for the coming academic year, providing local children access to quality education closer to home. Ultimately, the core issue is this: children who need schools and education. It is shameful that the UN put political consideration ahead of the educational and humanitarian needs of Kafr Aqib's children. Madam President, 5 years ago, I warned this Council about Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. We have all seen the consequences of allowing those threats to grow unchecked. Israel will not allow this to happen again. Today, we have an opportunity to choose a different path. In Gaza, that means the complete and verifiable disarmament of Hamas. In Lebanon, it means dismantling Hezbollah's military capability and restoring the authority of the Lebanese state. And across the region, it means confronting Iran's effort to arm, finance, and direct its terrorist proxies. Israel seeks a different future, one in which the people of Gaza can rebuild their lives. Lebanon can reclaim sovereignty over areas long controlled by Hezbollah, and Israelis can live without the constant threat of rockets, tunnel, and terrorism. The choice before us is clear: repeat the mistakes of the past, or ensure they are never repeated. Israel has made its choice. We choose security, we choose peace, and we are ready to work with those who choose the same. Thank you, Madam President.
10,214th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel and Qatar to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Ms. Ramiz Alakbarov, Acting Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, United Nations Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator; Mr. Nikolai Mladenov, High Representative for Gaza, Board of Peace, and Ms. Athena Rayburn, Executive Director of the Association of International Development Agencies. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov. Mr. Alakbarov, you don't have sound. Nope.
Please unmute yourself.
Nope, it's not working. Is somebody working on it?
Sir, please unmute.
If they manage to unmute, if not, we go to Mladenov first. You say with the permission of the council. So then I would say with the permission of council members, we give the floor to All right, it seems we have a little technical issue here. With the permission of council members, I'll suggest to just continue with the second speaker, and then we revert to you, Mr. Alakbarov, just after that. So I'll now give the floor to Mr. Nikolai Mladenov. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. Members of the Security Council, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council again. When I last appeared before you, I said that the credibility of any effort rests on telling the truth, including when it is uncomfortable. I intend to keep that promise today. In March, I reported that a framework for the decommissioning of weapons existed, and it had been put to the parties. In May, I presented to the Council the 15 articles of the roadmap itself. And on the 30th of July, Hamas and the Palestinian factions accepted the roadmap for completing the implementation of the comprehensive plan for Gaza. President Trump has called it a breakthrough. Indeed, it is a historic breakthrough. For the first time, Hamas and the armed factions in Gaza have agreed to hand over their weapons and to transfer full governing authority, civilian and security, to a transitional administration recognized by the United Nations. We now have the opportunity to dramatically improve life in a sustainable way for Palestinians in Gaza, to provide durable security for Israelis, and to move from a conflict that has destabilized the region to an environment that offers peace, prosperity, and economic opportunity for the entire Middle East. To achieve that transformation, we need the full implementation of the comprehensive plan and the roadmap. I know that some remain skeptical. I know that this Council has seen peace plans come and go and dissolve over time. It is, however, in the interest of Israelis and Palestinians alike, and of the entire region, that this plan does not unravel. The roadmap does not replace or contradict the comprehensive plan or UN Security Council Resolution 2803. It starts by reaffirming both as the guiding international framework and operationalizes what the Council has already decided. It covers the decommissioning of every category, let me repeat that, every category of weapon in Gaza. There is no gray zone and no category left out. Weapons are to be removed from factional control into the custody of the Transitional National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, the NCAG, and to be rendered unusable under international supervision. Withdrawal follows verified decommissioning and proceeds in phases. It is sequenced and reciprocal. Each step rests on the successful completion of the one before it. Gaza cannot be disarmed in a fortnight. What the roadmap fixes is not a date of completion, but the order in which things should happen and the standard of proof required at each stage. The National Committee is composed of independent Palestinian professionals. Every police officer they will hire will be vetted, and those who fail vetting will not carry a weapon. An Implementation Verification Committee, the IVC, will certify compliance. It will be led by the Board of Peace and the United States and supported by the International Stabilization Force and the mediators. Israel is not a signatory to the roadmap, and in fact, we never asked it to be one. We asked Israel to reaffirm its commitments under the Comprehensive Plan and the Sharm el-Sheikh Protocol. While it has reaffirmed that framework, important questions of implementation still remain open. Nothing in the roadmap, Madam President, asks Palestinians to relinquish their rights and their aspirations. The credible pathway to a political horizon is in the Comprehensive Plan, and it is reaffirmed in the roadmap. Madam President, an agreed document on disarmament does not immediately mean a disarmed Gaza. But no one should understate that what was achieved in the roadmap contains three things that did not exist at any point in time before us. First is acceptance. Hamas and the factions have accepted, in public, the comprehensive plan and the framework requiring their complete demilitarization and a complete handover of governance in Gaza, civilian and security, direct and indirect. The second is agreement on a key principle: one authority, one law, one weapon. The claim of every armed movement around the world rests on the right to hold weapons outside the legitimate authority. This principle requires that the factions relinquish that claim. Thirdly is the architecture. Progress is performance-based, not calendar-based. A phase opens only when the previous one has been certified as completed. That constrains all sides, and all must understand it as such. Our approach in the implementation phase will be to trust nothing and verify everything. What has been agreed on paper will matter only if it is translated into verified action. Madam President, as you and the rest of the Council know quite well from your own experience, much of the debate about Gaza is a debate about either weapons or the miserable conditions in the Strip. This is understandable. But Gaza's crisis has never been only a security or a humanitarian problem. It has always been a political and a governance problem. For nearly 20 years, political authority, military power, and public administration were fused into the hands of a militant faction that built up its arsenal and capabilities. Israel dealt with it as a security problem, to be managed rather than resolved, an approach that neither disarmed that faction nor displaced it, but it preserved it as the only address for everyone in Gaza. The price paid for that status quo of 2 decades was paid in blood. Repeated wars, economic collapse, isolation, and immense suffering for both Israelis and Palestinians. That is why the alternative to armed rule cannot be built in the absence of a legitimate civilian authority. Under UN Security Council Resolution 2803, the National Committee, the NCAC, was constituted in January. It is led by Dr. Ali Shah and has developed into an administration that is ready for deployment. It has established its operational plans for policing, for public payments, for security, and for early recovery. On security, it has designed the structure of the future civilian police and built the vetting system that is required to staff it. It has prepared a 6-month Gaza recovery program drawn from a broader 2-year plan covering infrastructure, economic recovery, public administration, human development, digital transformation, legal affairs, peace and security, policing, weapons collection, decommissioning, and tunnels clearance. The National Committee is not intended, and it will never be, a replacement to the Palestinian Authority. Its purpose is to govern during the transition and restore effective administration. Administrative transition will ultimately be judged not by the structures that we establish, but whether Palestinians experience greater security, more reliable services, and a measurable improvement in their daily lives. Madam President, before I turn to the humanitarian situation, let me say what no indicator can actually carry. Behind every story and every statistic from Gaza, there is a real human, personal, and painful tragedy. Almost 3 years of war have left the people of Gaza bereaved, displaced, and exhausted. Next to them live the families in Israel who lost their loved ones in the massacre of October 7th. Grief in this conflict has never respected and will never respect lines, fences, borders, or walls. Nothing said in this chamber will restore what has been lost by the people. Unfortunately, vengeance will only beget more vengeance, and the cycle of pain will never end. However, what we owe all these families is not yet another expression of sympathy, but relief, security, and a way out of this cycle of pain and suffering. A year ago, almost to this day in fact, the Famine Review Committee confirmed famine in Gaza, the first time ever recorded in the region. In August 2025, 1 in 7 children screened was acutely malnourished. Nearly 13,000 were identified in a single month. Today, that picture has significantly improved. By December 2025, the IPC had declared famine conditions offset, and its most recent survey found acute malnutrition mitigated across the Strip. That did not happen on its own. It was achieved through the partnership of the Board of Peace, the United Nations, the non-governmental organizations, bilateral and multilateral donors, and the State of Israel. I record this plainly, but I will not overstate it. These gains rest on sustained delivery. They are real, but they are also very easily reversible. The pressing needs since then have now moved. They are sanitation, water and energy, as well as the continuing restrictions on materials that can enter Gaza. Here too, through tireless work with the United Nations and the NGOs, we have a plan to address immediate WASH needs. Several projects, in fact, have already been coordinated with Israel and approved in the areas of sanitation, clean water, and public health, and we will be moving forward to implementation soon. Despite this, OCHA has reported continuing shortfalls in funding, and UN agencies are warning that the pipeline for food and other critical humanitarian items is at risk as early as the end of September this year. That is not settled. What is not settled is shelter. Winter is around the corner, and Israel's present policy on quality shelter is not acceptable. The Board of Peace urges the State of Israel to allow better shelter into the Strip for dignity, for health, and for safety. The International Stabilization Force, Madam President, continues also to generate under the command of U.S. Major General Jasper Jeffers. Sites are being prepared, and further countries are joining those that have stepped forward. I thank them, and I renew my appeal for continued contributions. The Board of Peace and the ISF are also preparing a monitoring and compliance mechanism that will support the implementation moving forward. We will track implementation of the commitments by the parties and progress in the handover of governance responsibility to the National Committee. This is a critical tool to build confidence, track progress, and identify obstacles early enough to address them. Alongside, we're also implementing a very much needed deconfliction arrangement, a coordination cell and a liaison through which emerging threats on the ground can be raised and dealt with before they escalate. In our last meeting with the Prime Minister of Israel, we went through his government's concerns one by one and narrowed the areas that still require technical work. We reaffirmed a shared objective, a demilitarized Gaza that can never again pose a threat. We also agreed on a mechanism through which remaining questions will be settled and established committees for that purpose, and they are already meeting. This is not a process that is stalled. It has moved from the negotiating table to the engineering table. Madam President, I will not pretend to this Council that the road ahead is going to be easy. The first risk is the distance between what has been agreed and what is happening on the ground. Israeli strikes have continued since the roadmap was accepted, and Palestinian civilians are still being killed. The ceasefire holds, and casualties have fallen sharply, but they have not stopped. A ceasefire, in fact, under which civilians are still buried, is not yet one that the people of Gaza can really feel. Every use of force that does not answer an immediate threat, and every incident that the deconfliction mechanism was not asked to resolve, costs the process something that is very, very hard to buy back. After 3 years of war and 20 years of military operations, I ask, will another strike on a munitions depot stop Hamas from rearming or tightening its grip on Gaza? It will not. It only delays the demilitarization that would happen, and it obstructs the civilian transition that should take place to ensure that remilitarization will not be possible in the future. The second risk runs in the opposite direction. Hamas has committed to cease all military activities. That commitment is still to be met in full. Every weapon carried, every tunnel still worked on, and every convoy still obstructed sets the process back and hands an argument to those who want to resume war. And as experience has shown, it will be Palestinian civilians, women and children, who will bear the consequences. Gaza, Madam President, does not have it in it to have another catastrophe. If this ceasefire collapses and the Strip spirals into another full escalation, there will be no roadmap to return to, there will be no administration to deploy, and there will be nothing left on the ground to rebuild. That would not be a setback. It would be a point of no return for everyone. The third risk is time. Another winter is coming for people living in rubble and in tents. Ceasefires that deliver nothing visible are not sustained by patience, they are only exhausted by it. Madam President, none of this is an argument for stopping. It is an argument for knowing exactly what comes next. 3 things must be in place for the process to move forward. The ISF needs to be able to deploy, Israel's undertakings under the Sharm el-Sheikh Protocol need to be implemented, and Hamas must adhere to its commitments. It is then that we can begin in those areas that conditions are best. The National Committee and the ISF will enter Gaza. The committee will begin to exercise its civil governance while completing vetting and handover procedures. Police weapons will be handed over to the committee's custody for dismantling. Heavy weapons, depots, tunnels, and production sites will be declared and moved for decommissioning. Militia and light weapons will also be decommissioned. That unlocks real change that people can actually see. Civil police, rather than armed men on the streets, shelter before winter, recovery and rehabilitation, and the prospect of reconstruction and Israeli withdrawal. Reconstruction at scale will follow verified and irreversible progress on demilitarization. It is the only way to ensure that what is built is not going to be destroyed again. Madam President, finally, I have 3 requests of the Council. First, please say plainly and repeatedly what this Council has already decided. The complete decommissioning of weapons in Gaza and the implementation of the Sharm el-Sheikh Agreement are requirements of the framework endorsed by Security Council Resolution 2803 and the only route to Israeli withdrawal, reconstruction at scale, and creating the conditions for a credible political path towards Palestinian self-determination and statehood. Secondly, I call on all member states to work with the Board of Peace and the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, as well as the United Nations, to ensure that the necessary support and resources are mobilized. The International Security Force requires troops, equipment, and enabling capabilities. The National Committee requires support for police training, public administration, and recovery. Gaza's students, the sick, and the injured require countries willing to host them and provide education opportunities and medical treatment. And last but not least, please preserve the political destination of this transition. Madam President, there's an old saying in the Middle East, trust God, but tie your camel. That is more or less the architecture of this roadmap. No one is asked to rely on anyone else's good faith. But a mechanism is only a mechanism. It cannot manufacture political will, and it cannot manufacture time. What it can do is remove excuses. After the roadmap, no one can credibly say that there is no framework, that the obligations are unclear, or that compliance cannot be measured. One question I'm often asked is there an alternative? I have heard some object to the roadmap. I have yet to hear an alternative plan, yet I see only two choices. The first is Israeli reoccupation of Gaza, with one party governing 2 million people at a massive human, economic, and reputational cost. The second is to allow the status quo that produced October 7th and everything that has followed it to quietly reassemble itself. A Gaza in which Hamas is neither disarmed nor removed from governance, but managed, contained. That is not a new policy. Neither option is a strategy, and both are actually postponement, and both end in the same place. What remains is actually a choice: a Gaza disarmed, rebuilt, and reconnected to the world, or a Gaza rearmed, divided and in rubble, with a radicalized generation raised inside it, and the next war already on the horizon. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Mladenov for his briefing. I'll now give the floor to Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov, hoping that the technical difficulties have been solved. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Am I audible now? Can you hear us?
Yeah. Yes. Please go ahead.
Madam President, thank you. Madam President, members of the Security Council, I'm briefing you today as tensions are rising and uncertainty deepens in the occupied Palestinian territory. As talks continue on implementation of the Resolution 2803 and the comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict, the ceasefire remains fragile. Israeli strikes on Gaza are continuing while humanitarian and security challenges persist. Meanwhile, situation in the West Bank continues to rapidly deteriorate. Madam President, I would like to acknowledge the presence of High Representative Mladenov and thank him for his persistent efforts, including recent discussions with the parties on the 15-point roadmap. Full implementation would advance the plan's transitional arrangements, including disarmament of Hamas and all other armed groups, the withdrawal of IDF from Gaza, the deployment of International Stabilization Force, ISF, and the transfer of transitional governance responsibility to the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, NCAG. I urge all parties to build on this momentum, fulfill their commitments, and advance the roadmap in accordance with international law. These steps must lay the groundwork for the broader objective, the establishment of a political horizon that will end the unlawful occupation, realize Palestinians' right for self-determination, and advance a two-state solution, with Palestine and Israel living side by side on the basis of the June 1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. Addressing the dire situation in Gaza remains paramount. People in Gaza continue to endure intolerable conditions and immense hardships, and they're losing hope. Israeli airstrikes resumed on 12 August following a week-long lull, while military activity, including shelling, drone attacks, and ground operations, never stopped. During the reporting period, over 100 Palestinians were killed and over 400 injured, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health. Around two-thirds of Gaza remains inaccessible or subject to severe access restriction, leaving civilians confined to overcrowded and insecure areas. The needs are immense and urgent. Humanitarian actors, specifically INGOs, continue to face operational constraints related to access, supplies, and funding, with the 2026 flash appeal only 40% funded. More than 10 months into the ceasefire, the situation is unacceptable, and key bottlenecks must be addressed. I'm sure that our colleague Athena, representing INGOs, will speak broadly to these matters and more. Soon, Madam President, winter will descend on Gaza. Winterization efforts must be scaled up and facilitated. Plans are in place, but stocks of shelter and non-food items are depleted. access constraints on the entry of humanitarian items continue, and funding remains critically low. We must all do better. Gaza should not face another window in cold tents. Madam President, the truth is, improving living conditions in Gaza requires moving beyond emergency relief. Essential systems and services must be restored with no further delay, particularly sewage, waste management, health services, and essential livelihoods. Specifically, we must restore electricity, including the Gaza power plant. A reliable electricity supplies remain critical to the functioning of water, sanitation, and other essential services. Fuel and engine oil must be allowed to enter at scale. People of Gaza deserve dignity, stability, and hope. Palestinians expect us to deliver more. As I said, they should not face another winter and cold. Human dignity must be at the center of all efforts. The recovery of human remains and their dignified burial must be facilitated without delay. The conflict has also inflicted significant environmental damage. Massive quantities of untreated sewage are flowing as they speak into the Mediterranean every day, uncontained by borders. This must be addressed. The clearance of exploding hazards is equally vital for any efforts on the grounds to proceed. Over 6 months since the reopening of Rafah crossings, over 5,400 Palestinians have been able to exit, and over 5,400 have returned to Gaza, accessing vital medical treatment and reconnecting families. Increased movement in both directions is essential. Patients from Gaza must be facilitated to receive specialized care in West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and internationally. In parallel, access to medical services must be expanded in Gaza, enabling its dedicated medical professionals to carry out their vital work. Madam President, women and girls are key to recovery efforts. The message from women-led organizations in Gaza is clear. Nothing should be written without the people in Gaza. They have to write the first step in every planning, in every recovery. This will require all parties to fulfill their commitments, as well as enhanced coordination between all stakeholders must be put in place. An effective and operational liaison function between the Palestinian Authority and the NCAC is critical. It is equally imperative that the international community aligns behind a unified national Palestinian recovery plan, addressing the needs identified in RDNA. In this context, I led a UN delegation for the meeting hosted in Cairo with the NCAC, during which we reviewed practical coordination mechanisms. Madam President, in recent years, Arab countries have contributed over half of all resources dedicated to the relief efforts in the OPT. As resources are stretched globally, the role of the region remains essential. I would like to recognize Egypt's steadfast commitment to humanitarian action. The Egyptian corridor has facilitated the entry of 500,000 tons of aid from various donors' organizations. Egypt supports 18 displacement sites inside Gaza and recently restored electricity services for some 11,000 people, one of the few places in Gaza where every family has electricity. Sustained engagement by Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey has also been instrumental in advancing mediation efforts. Qatar has also remained a steadfast partner through its strong field presence, providing shelter and non-food items. United Arab Emirates remains the largest humanitarian donor to the Gaza response, through chivalrous Night Operation Free, and has been a vital partner in bringing critical humanitarian items to Gaza. Jordan supports Gaza through humanitarian assistance and health care. The Jordan Corridor remains an important source of supplies and must be enabled to operate at full scale. Jordan also maintains its special and historic role at the holy sites in Jerusalem. Saudi Arabia continues to demonstrate important leadership in sustaining international support for the two-state solution, including through the Global Alliance. I look forward to these efforts being further advanced during next month's high-level meeting marking the anniversary of the New York Declaration. I would like to thank countries of the region for what they do and ask them to stay on it. Madam President, the situation in the West Bank remains dire. Large-scale settler attacks continue with virtually no accountability for these crimes. Israeli security forces have frequently failed to protect Palestinians from settler attacks and, in some cases, have reportedly facilitated or participated in such violence. Israel, as the occupying power, must ensure that the civilian population is protected and perpetrators are held to account. On 18 August, the Israeli authorities opened bidding for over 1,200 housing units in the E1 area of East Jerusalem. If implemented, the E1 plan will effectively sever the northern and southern parts of the Western Bank and its connection to East Jerusalem, eroding prospects for a viable Palestinian state. I reiterate that settlements have no legal validity and they are a flagrant violation of international law. Yesterday, the Israeli authorities forcibly entered and unlawfully seized the UNRWA Kalandia Training Center in East Jerusalem. On Monday, members of my team participated in a PA-led diplomatic visit to the center, which plays a critical role in the community. I reiterate my call on Israel to act in accordance with its obligation under international law. All efforts to seize, control, or expropriate UNRWA facilities must cease. Madam President, Palestinian authorities' fiscal crisis remains acute. Israel continues to withhold some $6 billion equivalent in shekels, including its revenues, while uncertainty over corresponding banking poses a further serious threat to Palestinian financial stability. The parties must urgently secure a long-term extension of the corresponding banking arrangements, allowing regulators time to implement suitable solutions. Madam President, Gaza's recovery and reconstruction and the broader political process are mutually dependent and neither can be sustained in isolation. We have the means to advance a credible path forward. There is a broad consensus on the essential elements of that path. Security Council Resolution 2803 must be implemented immediately and in full. Equally, the New York Declaration should be advanced in parallel and in a mutually reinforcing manner. Together with previous Security Council resolutions, they provide a political vision, practical framework, and a coordinated international effort needed to support Gaza's recovery, reunify Gaza and West Bank under a single legitimate Palestinian government, end the unlawful occupation, and advance the two-state solution. We must act now to translate this vision into concrete steps. The United Nations remains committed to supporting all efforts towards a lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace and security. And thank you, Madam President, and the members of the Council for your attention.
And I thank Mr. Alekbara for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Athena Rayburn.
Madam President, Excellencies, on behalf of IDA, the Association of International Development Agencies, the umbrella organization bringing together over 100 international development and humanitarian NGOs operating in the occupied Palestinian territories, I wish first to thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council during today's session. Madam President, I will not spend time today to remark on the nominal improvement of the humanitarian situation inside Gaza since the October 2025 ceasefire. Nor will I remark on the number of trucks, pallets, and tonnage of aid that has entered Gaza, or even the numbers that have been denied. This is because, regardless of the volumes of assistance, metrics of aid getting into Gaza do not negate the abhorrent and more relevant reality that we have normalized a situation in which 2 million people are trapped and dependent on humanitarian assistance that is controlled and restricted by the state that has designed this scarcity. Yes, the latest IPC figures show we have clawed our way back from an engineered famine in Gaza, but it is a disturbing marker of progress to celebrate that a child that may no longer be at imminent risk of starving to death may still be killed at any moment from shelling, airstrikes, or gunfire, or may survive only to carry the consequences of hunger, devastation, and deprivation for the rest of their life. At this scale, these consequences will be felt for generations. This is not success. Let me be clear. Improvements that have been reported to this Council are not a cause for celebration, nor do they shift or dilute the responsibility that ultimately still sits in this room. We have a collective responsibility to ensure a durable response This means sustained humanitarian access, delivery of basic services, recovery, and the creation of conditions in which people in Gaza can begin to live rather than just survive the next 24 hours. This reality, this shared responsibility, is what I will focus my remarks on today. Excellencies, what is imperative for this Council to note is that while Resolution 2803 helped provide a framework within which the reduction in hostilities became possible, the measure of that framework is not whether a Board of Peace, an international stabilization force, or even a national committee for the administration of Gaza has been created. It must be whether those institutions are, in the short term, providing immediate protection, relief, and safety for the civilian population, and in the long term, moving Gaza towards the required legal endpoint that has already been adjudicated, the end of Israel's unlawful presence and the realization of the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination. By these basic measures, the Board of Peace is failing. What is evident is that with the operationalization of the Gaza Board of Peace, the rights of Palestinians in Gaza have been made subordinate to the far-reaching, capricious, and arbitrary requirements of its occupier. This is untenable. Madam President, the situation for international NGOs operating in the occupied Palestinian territory is a vivid example of the fact the Board of Peace has not only done nothing to wrest control of the Gaza Strip from the State of Israel, but has also so far functioned to further entrench Israel's unlawful presence. It is under the Board of Peace's oversight that Israeli authorities deregistered over 30 international organizations renowned for their capacity to deliver assistance worldwide in some of the most complex crises on earth. With the new registration process created by the Israeli government in March 2025 and implemented in January of this year, among other authorities granted, Israel unlawfully granted itself the authority to deny access to the occupied Palestinian territory to any organization it deems critical of their unlawful actions in Gaza or the West Bank. In meetings with Israeli authorities and NGO representatives last year, it was made clear: deliver and stay silent, or your delivery will not be enabled at all. Madam President, across the occupied Palestinian territory, INGOs represent over half of all active health partners, providing over 100,000 general clinical consultations per month and supporting the bulk of critical health system functions in Gaza. The shelter response is led by INGOs, who accounted for more than 74% of shelter and non-food item activities last year, and we are one of the only providers of inpatient treatment for children suffering from severe and acute malnutrition inside Gaza. The State of Israel has taken this path since the October 2025 ceasefire announcement to restrict these organizations, in full knowledge of the size and scope of their operations and the impact this would have on the humanitarian response. I can attest to this, having in negotiations with the Israeli authorities shared this information myself directly with them in full transparency and on multiple occasions in the presence of permanent sitting members of this council. The facts of INGO's operational capacity and presence in Gaza are also matters of public record, as are the acute needs in Gaza documented and reported to this council for almost 3 years. What remains unclear, however, is the legal basis on which the State of Israel continues to obstruct the provision of impartial humanitarian assistance in direct contraventions with its unconditional obligations under Article 59 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. What is also unclear is why the mandate which this Council handed to the Board of Peace is being used to obfuscate Israel's continued actions that are violating the fundamental rights of Palestinians in Gaza and the most basic rules of international humanitarian law. This cannot be the new status quo. Madam President, since the ceasefire was announced and the Board of Peace was created, in addition to the barring of many international aid organizations, it has overseen the deaths of over 1,000 Palestinians reported to have been killed by the Israeli military, continued rejections of medical items considered dual use, including basic medical items such as scissors, crutches, wheelchairs, and prosthetic limbs, continuing and arbitrary restrictions on engine oil, forcing the cost of engine oil up to 45 times its normal price, bringing the humanitarian response today to an absolute breaking point. Rejections of fresh produce, such as watermelon and onions, for the reason this is not within the humanitarian policy, is not permitted for entry at this time. A policy that has never been fully published or made available. continuing rejections of international specialized medical staff seeking to enter Gaza, and the almost daily movement of the supposedly fixed yellow ceasefire line that has now moved so far west since October, it has restricted or resulted in the full loss of access to at least 85 humanitarian facilities, including water points, schools, and health clinics. Humanitarian assistance, by its nature, cannot be conditioned, and yet we witness the Israeli authorities shrinking almost daily the physical space in Gaza in which we can operate, with no accountability for the consequences on the lives of Palestinians who continue to be treated barely as an afterthought. The Board of Peace, if claiming responsibility for the improvements on the situation on the ground in Gaza, must equally take ownership of and action on the violations that continue to be committed under its watch. The Board of Peace is either responsible for all developments, good and bad, or none of them. This leaves us with the question: which of these outcomes are intended, and which are a symptom of inherent flaws? Ultimately, it is this Council that must reckon with these possibilities, but it must be done urgently because the consequences of that reckoning are not here. They are in Gaza, where still almost 2/3 of the population live in tents or makeshift shelters, and in the last 72 hours alone, multiple airstrikes in deeply populated areas caused damage to humanitarian sites and put civilian and humanitarian personnel lives at risk. Madam President, I would use this moment to highlight to the Council that for almost 3 years, it is humanitarian actors working with communities on the ground that have been tasked with assessing the humanitarian situation inside Gaza. This is a duty we have discharged to the best of our abilities, and at the cost of the lives of over 400 of our colleagues who have been killed. When we describe the conditions, the abject horrors we have witnessed, and what is required to meet the immense needs, this is what we are seeing with our own eyes, what we are trained and qualified to assess and communicate to the world in good faith, with the only purpose being to alleviate human suffering and ensure the protection of the civilian population under international law. Almost 3 years, this Council has received contradictory reports on the levels of death and destruction, the number of trucks, aid getting in, aid getting denied, and detailed technical descriptions of the various obstructors and enablers of assistance. Even today, these conflicting reports are and will be evident in what is presented to you. What is critical is that your action is guided by credible, on-the-ground knowledge from actors with the required experience, expertise, and mandate to speak on these issues without bias. Madam President, with the adoption of Resolution 2803, the Council assigned clear responsibilities to ensure a comprehensive and long-lasting ceasefire in Gaza, the provision of humanitarian assistance, and a viable path forward for reconstruction and peace. But in doing so, the Council did not relinquish its primary responsibility under the Charter, nor did it suspend the legal order within which those responsibilities must be exercised. Madam President, Excellencies, today I would like to close by inviting the Council to reflect on how it is discharging those responsibilities. Are you able to satisfy yourselves that you are clear about the facts on the ground, the trajectory of the situation in Gaza? Are you clear on the reasons why we are almost 1 year into a so-called ceasefire and still advocating on the necessity of engine oil and fresh produce? Are you clear on the intentions for the planned communities being constructed in the south of Gaza under your mandate and their compatibility with your obligations to ensure the protection of Palestinians' fundamental rights? Madam President, Excellencies, if the answers to those questions is not an unequivocal yes, I do not ask you to take our professional assessment on trust. Instead, exercise your powers of inquiry and come and see for yourselves. We encourage the Council to undertake an urgent mission to Gaza. Let the reality on the ground, the facts, our colleagues and Palestinians speak to you themselves. We are here and we are ready to receive you. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. Rayburn for her briefing, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, High Representative Mladenov, Mr. Alekbarov, for your briefings today. Colleagues, UNICEF recently issued a report, June of this year. In its latest report, it opens with a photograph of an infant named Leah at a mobile clinic in Gaza City. She was there for a routine health checkup. And unlike her parents, she has a very real shot at growing up, having never experienced the repression and terror at the hands of Hamas. And that is something, colleagues, I think that we should take on board and understand that she has a chance here. And this same report from UNICEF found that acute malnutrition amongst children under 5 in accessible areas of Gaza has dropped by an incredible 82% in under 1 year. I say that again, 82% drop in malnutrition for children under 5 in areas of Gaza in just under 1 year. Of course, absolutely, we have a very long way to go, and I appreciate High Representative Mladenov's very candid assessment of both the progress and the needs we still have. But in UNICEF's words, quote, children's nutrition improves when aid and commercial supplies reach them, end quote. It should be no surprise, or it shouldn't be a shock to anyone here, that when terrorist groups stop hoarding and using aid as a cruel lever for control, that people's lives get better. But Madam President, frankly, after hearing Ms. Rayburn's briefing, it's quite disturbing to hear a representative of civil society at this council ignore UN reports, including by the Commission of Inquiry, frankly no friend of Israel over the years, with repeated incredible reports of torture by Hamas, not a word from Ms. Rayburn or civil society briefing, not a word on the kneecapping of Palestinians who recently dared to step out and protest Hamas's rule, not a word of other reports on Hamas using hospitals as human shields, building tunnels and command centers under schools. You know, it's amazing to see. Well, let me put it this way. You know who is not starving in Gaza, Ms. Rayburn and members of this council? Hamas fighters aren't starving. You don't see their leadership starving. You don't see their wives who are carrying Birkin bags on camera. They're not starving. So I would encourage everyone to reread. I'll encourage your civil society briefers to read all of Resolution 2803, debated extensively, but passed by this council without opposition, including the annex, which is the only UN document that says no annexation, at the same time says there is a pathway to a two-state with reform. Finally, through this council, just in the last year. And the progress that we've made is something I do think to be applauded, but realistically evaluated. And of course, we have a long way to go. But now Gaza has one of the lowest rates of acute malnutrition in the region. And that is a result of the work that many people have done to bring calm to Gaza. And for the first time in modern history, a new future for Gaza is credibly within reach. One without war, without terrorist overlords, without tunnels, without hostages, and without suffering. But that is only if those of us in this room and those engaged in this issue around the world keep up the pressure on Hamas. It'd be nice if we have briefers here that actually say Hamas and mention these terrorists. And we'll continue to call on support for President Trump's comprehensive plan that was endorsed by this council and has established the International Stabilization Force through Resolution 2803. Now, it shouldn't surprise anyone in this room that Hamas itself has committed to disarm twice now, actually. First, in October of 2025, following the president's peace plan, and again, just a few weeks ago, when it accepted the 15-point action actionable roadmap laid out by the Board of Peace to implement the plan. Obviously, there are skeptics. We hear them. We all know what kind of organization that we're dealing with. Hamas is a terrorist group responsible for horrific acts of violence against Americans, against Israelis, against the people of Gaza, and the rest of the world. And so, believe me when I say that we will judge Hamas by what it does, not only by what it says, but let's also remember something else. The skeptics said the hostages would never come home, and certainly not all of them, including, sadly, the dead. They did come home, each and every one. The skeptics said this war could not end until an agreement, or it could not end, and that an agreement could never be reached. But we did reach an agreement. And now they say Hamas will never disarm. We'll see. The thing is, we've heard the term impossible before. The president and his team have made a habit of proving conventional wisdom wrong. The ISF, the International Stabilization Force, is one example. For years, this council has debated the issue of Gaza. During the debate over 2803, we said repeatedly, there are two choices. Hamas rules, or the IDF occupies, or work with us on a third way. I hear a lot of critics, as the High Representative said, hand-wringing and criticizing, but I don't hear a lot of alternative, credible plans. Now, for the first time, troops and personnel from partner nations are scheduled to arrive to keep the peace. Tactical vehicles are already at the ISF logistics base. Countries as far as Uganda, Morocco, Kazakhstan have offered thousands of troops to this effort. No, they are not moving as quickly as we would like, but they are moving. And yes, the disarmament of Hamas must and will be closely scrutinized. It must be verified by objective parties. Nothing and not one thing will be taken on trust, but let's not have small ambitions here. With a verified process, we have the potential to unlock a future for the people of Gaza, free from Hamas, free from suffering under terrorists that raped and pillaged them for a generation. And once Hamas demonstrates full compliance with their commitments, Israel will begin its phased and eventually complete withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. So think of those words from the comprehensive plan to end the war of Gaza again. Remember the Council's pledge. Gaza cannot sustainably rebuild while Hamas retains the ability to plunge it back into war. We will be frozen in a cycle of humanitarian aid rather than rebuilding until Hamas disarms and demilitarizes. So colleagues, let's sum this up. Last fall, war, hostages, suffering, and now less than a year later, after the passage of 2803, there are no hostages in Gaza. Aid by the UN's own figures and report are reaching those in need. Not enough, but far more than it was. Hamas has agreed to disarm in full. The IDF is pulling back, and the NCAG is authorized to move in. So President Trump's peace plan, the 15-point roadmap, are our best hope for peace in Gaza. Let's please put politics and agendas aside. Let's support this new way. And let's realize a better future for that young girl in UNICEF's recent report. I thank you, Madam President.
And I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I would first of all like to thank the Acting Special Coordinator, Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov, the High Representative for Gaza of the Board of Peace, Mr. Nikolai Mladenov, and the Executive Director of AIDA, Ms. Athena Rayburn, for their briefings. I would like to address the situation in Gaza and the West Bank together. They are the two integral parts of Palestine, the future of which is indissociable. Madam President, regarding Gaza, we listened with interest to Mr. Mladenov's assessment of the implementation of Resolution 2803. For France, this resolution is a path of peace and of reconstruction for Gaza, with a view towards peace between Israel and Palestine through the two-state solution. France welcomed the agreement on the disarmament of Hamas and armed factions. Everyone knows the terrible work that they have done, and I would like to thank Mr. Mladinov for the clarifications that he has provided in that regard. That disarmament for France is a demand that we have been making for a long time and which is at the heart of the New York Declaration as well. We commend the United States, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey for their efforts to that end. We call upon all parties to seize upon this agreement because for it to have effect, Israel as well as Hamas must engage in good faith. It is important that Hamas disarm. It is important for the Israeli army to withdraw and for the International Committee for the Administration of Gaza and the International Stabilization Force be deployed in support for the Palestinian forces and in preparation for the full return of the Palestinian Authority. The urgent humanitarian situation remains the case, given the disastrous situation. Obstacles to the delivery of assistance and the work of humanitarian actors remain the case, which are driven by the arbitrary closing of crossing points. The obstacles to essential products that are said to be of dual use is not tenable, and nothing justifies these blockages. We are worried by daily violations of the ceasefire. We firmly condemn the public statements by the Israeli National Security Minister, Mr. Ben-Gvir, calling a few days ago for 30 or 40 people in Gaza to be killed each night. It is incumbent upon Israel to respect its obligations under international law and to implement the peace plan. It is essential that recovery and reconstruction efforts begin in a framework that is in accordance with international law. The restoration of decent living conditions cannot be subordinated to the finalization of the disarmament process. We call upon our partners to support these efforts within the framework of the United Nations. Madam President, what is happening in the West Bank is disgraceful and must give this Council pause. The publication by the Israeli government of tenders for the E1 settlement project is unacceptable and is contrary to international law and also contrary to Resolution 2334. This project would cut the West Bank in two and would deal an irreversible blow to the territorial contiguity of the Palestinian state and to the two-state solution. We call upon Israel to reverse this decision and we warn businesses of the legal, economic, and reputational risks that they face by participating. The intensification of acts of terror by settlers and the climate of impunity in which they are prospering are also alarming. We call upon Israel to guarantee the protection of the Palestinian population, to arrest and to prosecute those responsible, as it has the obligation to do under international law. France and its European partners will remain mobilized. Sanctions have been adopted against the responsible entities and individuals, and new ones could also be adopted. Obstacles to the essential work of UNRWA remain in effect, as is illustrated by the Israeli incursion yesterday in its training center in Kalandia. We call upon Israel to cease these unacceptable attacks and to respect UN immunities and privileges. Lastly, it is urgent that Israel transfer to the Palestinian Authority the tax revenues due to it and that it restore banking links in the long term. If it doesn't do this, the ability of the Palestinian Authority to provide essential services to its population and to implement the necessary reforms would be compromised. Madam President, the untenable situation in Gaza and in the West Bank is compromising the prospects provided by the ceasefire agreement, the peace plan, and Resolution 2803. This situation is jeopardizing the two-state solution and regional stability. It is for this Council to preserve this political prospect and to guarantee the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people and the security of Israel. France will continue to work to this end in accordance with the New York Declaration. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, I thank Acting Special Coordinator Alakabarov, Mr. Mladenov, and Ms. Rabin for their briefings. Lately, the situation in occupied Palestinian territory has continued to escalate, as evidenced by sharp rise in violence, repeated incidents where justice and fairness were betrayed, and moral bottom lines breached, casting an even darker shadow over the resolution of the Palestinian question. The Palestinian people have suffered immensely, and for generations they have been waiting for the historical injustice to be rectified. The international community must put a timely stop to any further harm to the Palestinian people, save the political prospect of the two-state solution, and make every effort to achieve lasting peace. I will make 3 points. First, no effort should be spared to uphold the ceasefire in Gaza and restore peace and stability at an early date. Recently, the Board of Peace announced progress made on second phase arrangement of the ceasefire agreement, yet Israel not only openly rejected it, but even went so far as to intensify its devastating attacks on Gaza, imperiling the fragile situation there. The facts are very clear. The crux of the unrealized lasting peace in Gaza is the lack of political will to achieve peace. And the biggest obstacle is the dangerous attempt to deliberately prolong the hostilities. We urge relevant parties, particularly Israel, to sincerely and fully implement the ceasefire agreement and take positive steps towards lasting peace. Countries with significant influence on the parties should take an impartial position and make concrete efforts to advance the Middle East peace process. The international community, especially the Security Council, must earnestly shoulder its responsibility to protect civilians in Gaza, ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid, and prevent an even more severe humanitarian disaster. Second, we need to stop acts of violence and annexation and ease tensions in the West Bank. The security situation in the West Bank is becoming increasingly precarious, and incidents of violence against the Palestinian civilians are appalling. In recent days, West Bank settlers besieged the Palestinian residents for days in an attempt to drive them out and seize their homes. China strongly condemns such acts. In defiance of the strong oppositions from international community, Israel launched tenders for settlement construction in the E1 area. This move will seriously undermine the integrity of the Palestinian territory and the very foundation of the two-state solution. Any attempted de facto annexation of the West Bank is unacceptable. All settlement activities are in violation of international law and Security Council resolutions and must cease immediately. We urge Israel to fulfill its obligation as occupier and curb settler violence rather than tacitly condone it. Economic conditions in the West Bank continue to deteriorate. Israel should return promptly the withheld tax revenues and lift undue restrictions on the movement of people and goods. Yesterday, Israel again furthered its strangulation of the UNRWA, forcibly entering and occupying the Kalandia Training Center. China expresses grave concerns over the incident and urges Israel to respect UNRWA's privileges, immunities, and normal operation. Third, we must defend international fairness and justice and advance implementation of the two-state solution. The fundamental way to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli question is to stay committed to a political settlement and to the two-state solution as the right way to go. Resume peace talks between Palestinians and Israelis, and to achieve an independent Palestinian statehood at an early date, as well as a harmonious coexistence of the Arab and Jewish nations. However, we have heard ongoing voices that reject and deny the two-state solution and are deeply concerned. Palestine is the homeland of all Palestinians. Governance in the West Bank and the post-war reconstruction in Gaza must be conducted in line with the principle of Palestinians governing Palestine. The international community should, on the basis of international law and aimed at both symptoms and root causes, take practical actions to support the just cause of the Palestinian people in pursuit of their legitimate national interests and in rights, reject any unilateral action that undermine the foundation of the two-state solution, and promote a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the Palestinian question at an early date. The Palestinian leaders' legitimate right to attend ongoing general debate should be safeguarded. President, the question of Palestine has always been at the heart of the Middle East issue. It must not be marginalized or instrumentalized. Palestinian people must not become victims of geopolitical contest. The Palestinian question has been on the UN agenda for more than 70 years, and its solution is long overdue. China stands ready to work with the international community to jointly push for an end of hostilities, ease the humanitarian disaster, and implement the two-state solution, thereby making greater contribution to an early end to the suffering of the Palestinian people and achieving lasting peace and stability in Middle East. Thank you, President.
The representative of China for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank Acting Special Coordinator Ramiz Al-Akbarov and High Representative Nikolai Mladenov for their comprehensive briefings. And we also take good note of the statement by Ms. Rayburn, particularly including her reminder to this Council regarding its responsibilities under the UN Charter. As we have heard today, the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory is at a critical inflection point. We are witnessing two dangerous and mutually reinforcing trends. First, systematic violations of international law continue with impunity. Second, deliberate illegal actions on the ground are undermining the territorial and political foundations of a viable future Palestinian state, and linked with that, the prospects of lasting peace. And together, these actions by the occupying power are prolonging the present crisis and deepening the humanitarian suffering. Despite the clear position of this Council and repeated calls for their cessation, Israel's illegal settlement activities continue unabated. The advancement of the E1 settlement project, which would effectively sever the West Bank, is particularly alarming. And beyond threatening the territorial contiguity of a future Palestinian state, the project places thousands of Palestinians at risk of forcible displacement. The foreign ministers of the group of 8 Arab Islamic countries, including Pakistan, have unequivocally condemned Israel's settlement policies and categorically rejected the E1 plan and called it a dangerous escalation. Settler violence has also reached alarming levels. The UN recorded approximately 190 attacks per month in early 2026, which is unacceptable and warrants urgent action. The continued withholding of around $6 billion in Palestinian clearance revenue is undermining the financial position of the Palestinian Authority and its ability to provide essential services. These revenues must be released without delay. Madam President, the situation in Gaza remains equally grave, as testified by the briefers. Despite the ceasefire and the positive diplomatic developments, Palestinians continue to face death, destruction, and severe humanitarian hardship. Since the announcement of ceasefire, more than 1,200 Palestinians have been killed. Israeli violations have continued, including repeated, unjustified, and highly indiscriminate attacks on civilian infrastructure, while the humanitarian situation remains extremely fragile. So, under the circumstances, there is a valid question. If the ceasefire is holding, as we are being told, then how are strikes continuing and civilians being killed? it must be underlined that ceasefire was the first, most essential step of the plan. It must be fully respected. And ceasefire, as noted by Mr. Mladenov, must deliver for the people. There are nevertheless positive developments under President Trump's comprehensive plan for Gaza, endorsed by the UN Security Council Resolution 2803, and subsequent actions by the Board of Peace. Notable efforts have been undertaken to advance peace and take the process forward. However, despite the mediation by the United States, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, Israel's continued military escalation and rejection of the roadmap threaten to derail this diplomatic process and undermine the prospects for peace. And President, we are also deeply concerned by the unauthorized entries by Israeli authorities into UNRWA's premises in occupied East Jerusalem. The forcible entry into the Kalandia Training Center yesterday is particularly troubling. UN facilities and personnel must be respected and protected, and their privileges and immunities must be upheld in accordance with international law and the UN Charter. We believe urgent action is required from the international community, including this Council. First, Israel, the occupying power, must immediately halt all unlawful measures aimed at altering the legal, geographic, and demographic composition of the occupied Palestinian territory. This includes a complete end to all illegal settlement expansion, settler violence, annexation measures, and the forced displacement of Palestinians in line with Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 2334. I must note that all members around this table, all members of the Council, have rejected annexation. So we must therefore ensure that we stop all steps that are moving in that direction. Second, the Gaza peace plan and Resolution 2803 must be implemented fully and in good faith, starting with full enforcement of the ceasefire and its proper verification. 3, those with influence must use their diplomatic and economic leverage to enforce compliance with international law and Security Council resolutions. 4th, to ensure accountability for all violations of international law and international humanitarian law in the occupied Palestinian territory, including war crimes and other grave violations. Mr. Mladenov rightly referred to real human, personal, and painful tragedy behind the numbers and figures that we often hear. That is the tragedy endured by the besieged populations, the Palestinians, under a brutal occupation that has continued for decades. And that is the root cause of the problem. And it is that illegal occupation that must be vacated in the interests of durable peace and stability in the region, and which is a shared objective of this Council and the wider international community. Pakistan's solidarity with the Palestinian people remains firm. We stand with them in their legitimate struggle for dignity, justice, and self-determination. The only viable path to peace for all people in the region is a just, comprehensive peace based on UN Security Council resolutions and international legitimacy with the establishment of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state on pre-1967 borders and Al-Quds Al-Sharif as its capital. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for its statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank the Acting Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Dr. Ramiz Al-Akbarov, for his important briefing. It is also my honor to welcome the participation of the High Representative for Gaza and the Director General of the Board of Peace, Mr. Nikolai Mladenov, and we wish him luck in his endeavors. And we thank Ms. Athena Rayburn, the Executive Director of the Association of International Development Agencies, for her briefing. Allow me to address the following points. First, the Kingdom of Bahrain warns from the dangerous and ongoing escalation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, especially the increase in settler violence, settlement expansion, the destruction of homes, facilities, land seizure. This undermines trust and weakens the prospect of a two-state solution. We refer to the Security Council meeting held 2 weeks ago to discuss the dangerous developments in the West Bank. The Kingdom of Bahrain called for protecting civilians, especially children, and warned of the repercussions of escalatory and unilateral policies and procedures in the West Bank, as they could impose new realities on the ground. They could undermine the prospects for peace. The Kingdom, in this regard, fully rejects any attempt to annex any part of the Palestinian territory or any change of its geographic or demographic reality or the forcible displacement of the Palestinian people. We call on respecting international law, including international humanitarian law and relevant Security Council resolutions. The Kingdom of Bahrain stresses the importance of implementing Security Council Resolution 2803 and the comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict, and to support the progress made and the practical arrangements by the Board of Peace and the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza and the ISF. We also urge for removing all obstacles for strengthening the pillars of stability in Gaza, for reconstruction, for improving the living conditions, and for guaranteeing the delivery of humanitarian assistance at scale and in a sustainable manner, and to guarantee the complete Israeli withdrawal according to relevant arrangements, while reaffirming the unity of the Palestinian territory, and to move forward towards a political serious track that leads to achieving the two-state solution. We look forward to the different meetings that will be held on Palestine during the high-level week, during the 81st session of the General Assembly in September, to maintain the political and diplomatic momentum, reaffirming that the Palestinian question remains at the heart of international priorities. Second, the Kingdom of Bahrain warns of the repercussions of violations against Islamic and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem and any attempts to change the historic and legal identity and character of the city, especially as these acts provoke the sentiments of millions of Muslims and Christians around the world. We also reaffirm the importance of abiding by a rhetoric of coexistence and tolerance to confront extremism. It is important to respect the historic and legal status quo in the holy sites and to decisively put an end to violations, especially those that target Al-Aqsa Mosque with its 144 dunum area as a place of worship exclusively for Muslims. We reaffirm the importance of the historic Hashemite custodianship of Islamic and Christian holy sites in Al-Quds, and we value the role of the Committee of Jerusalem, presided by His Majesty the King of Morocco. Third, we commend the efforts of the Palestinian government to meet the aspirations of the Palestinian people and abide by a national reform program and move forward with the legislative elections on November 28, and to complete all democratic and electoral processes, including the presidential elections in 2027. We call on the international community to continue to support the Palestinian government, including the release of withheld Palestinian clearance revenues. We urge continued international and regional efforts and coordination to maintain the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, notably the right to self-determination, the establishment of an independent state along the lines of June 4, 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, side by side with the State of Israel, in peace and security pursuant to this two-state solution and resolutions of international legitimacy and the Arab peace process to achieve a just, comprehensive, and permanent peace. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Acting Special Coordinator Mr. Ramiz Al-Akbar for his informative briefing, and I welcome the Board of Peace High Representative for Gaza, Mr. Nikolai Mladenov, to this meeting and thank him for the comprehensive briefing. And I also thank Executive Director of the Association of International Development Agencies, Ms. Athena Rayburn, for her contribution to the discussion. Madam President, the comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict put forward by President Trump and endorsed by Resolution 2803 remains the core of ongoing international efforts to achieve peace and stability in the region. Latvia welcomes the continuing efforts of the Board of Peace and the mediating countries, Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, and the United States, to pursue the full implementation of the plan. To achieve this goal, all parties must engage genuinely and fulfill their commitments. Against this backdrop, I would like to underline 3 points. First, we note with deep concern the ongoing daily strikes that continue to cause further civilian casualties in Gaza. Since the announcement of the cessation of hostilities, more than 1,200 Palestinians have been killed and over 4,000 injured. Attacks endangering IDF soldiers also continue. And we once again call on all parties to respect the ceasefire in good faith and in its entirety, as required by the Comprehensive Plan and Resolution 2803. Israel's right and obligation to defend its citizens, deeply scarred by the October 7 terrorist attack, is a clear principle underpinning our diplomatic efforts. At the same time, international law and international humanitarian law must be fully respected, ensuring the protection of civilians, journalists, and humanitarian personnel across both Gaza and the West Bank. The rhetoric of annexation and statements calling for targeted killings of Palestinians expressed by some Israeli politicians are unacceptable. Further constructive steps are needed to advance the comprehensive plan and prevent resurgence of violence in Gaza. There is no future for non-state armed groups and terrorism in Gaza. We once again underline that complete disarmament of Hamas and its relinquishing of power are imperative. Concurrently, the deployment of the International Stabilization Force and the withdrawal of the IDF must take place, as outlined by Mr. Mladenov. With the support of the international community, including the UN agencies and the Palestine Donor Group, the work of the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza and its deployment on the ground is indispensable for restoring dignified living conditions to the people of Gaza, and it must start without further delay. The early involvement of the Palestinian Authority, alongside its ongoing reform efforts and preparations for the upcoming elections, would lay the foundation for future self-sustaining governance in Gaza. Second, 3 months before the anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 2803, the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains appalling. Conditions are continuously critical across multiple sectors, with severe water insecurity, depriving civilians of adequate access to safe drinking water and the water needed for basic hygiene and sanitation. These conditions are compounding already grave public health risks amid disrupted health services, damage to and attacks on healthcare facilities and personnel, and persistent shortages of essential medicines, medical supplies, and equipment. Repeated displacement continues to expose civilians to increasingly precarious conditions. And as we heard, there is an urgent need for basic shelter assistance and other vital relief to meet the needs of displaced families, especially ahead of the winter. Sustained, safe, and predictable humanitarian access remains essential to an effective response and must be facilitated without conditions in accordance with international humanitarian law and humanitarian principles. International humanitarian organizations, including UN agencies and international NGOs, continue to play a critical role in delivering life-saving assistance despite severe operational constraints, and their work must not be hindered. Third, the international community, including in this chamber, has repeatedly opposed the entrenching annexation of the West Bank. Today, we note with regret that the expansion of illegal Israeli settlements, including in the E1 area, continues. Increased settler attacks and harassment, movement restrictions, and demolition of property and infrastructure contribute to the forced displacement of Palestinians and fuel the vicious cycle of vengeance and radicalization. We urge Israel to address the situation in full respect of international law and commitments, including Security Council Resolution 2334, as well as all previous arrangements to which it has pledged itself. The withheld Palestinian tax revenues must be released without delay. Attacks against Israeli civilians, incitement to violence, and all forms of terrorism are equally unacceptable, and the Palestinian Authority must fulfill its commitments to pursue meaningful, comprehensive reforms. This includes strengthening governance and accountability, addressing radicalization, including education in line with UNESCO standards, and reforming the payment system for families of prisoners. Madam President, it is essential that the comprehensive plan delivers the expected results. Neither Israeli security concerns nor the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians can be realized amidst the risk of reigniting yet another devastating escalation. A political perspective encompassing Gaza and the West Bank is the only way to achieve long-term stability. It is crucial to continue and reinforce international engagement towards peaceful coexistence through the two-state solution, in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and the New York Declaration, and Latvia reaffirms its very firm commitment to the shared objective of peace and stability in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we thank the acting special coordinator for the Middle East peace process, Ramiz Alakbarov, and the High Representative of the Board of Peace, Nikolai Mladenov, for their briefings, and we listened very carefully to Ms. Athena Rayburn. Madam President, the assessment voiced today show the dangerous trajectory of developments in the occupied Palestinian territory, with all of the ensuing tragic consequences for both sides of the conflict and for the entire region. The events of recent months vividly confirm that the lack of progress on the Palestinian-Israeli track is fraught with further suffering and loss of civilian life, as well as with the exacerbation and emergence of new hotspots of tension throughout the Middle East. We all remember how the majority in this chamber placed their hopes on Security Council Resolution 2803, supporting Trump's peace plan for the Gaza Strip as the path towards ending violence in the region. We would also like to recall that our country, largely at the request of our friends from the Arab and Muslim world, did not stand in the way of the adoption of this document. At the same time, we provided a detailed analysis of all of the pitfalls of such a hasty decision by the Council. We warned of the risks of ignoring the broad internationally recognized legal framework for the Middle East settlement and its key element, namely the two-state formula. The fact that, thanks to active international mediation efforts, large-scale bloodshed in Gaza was halted is indisputable and deserves every support. However, unfortunately, it's still too early to speak of the advent of lasting peace in the Strip. Violations of the ceasefire regime in Gaza and the killing of Palestinians have continued systematically 10 months after the formal entry into force of the agreement. And this is clearly reflected in the statistics. The number of those killed since the 10th of October 2025 as a result of Israeli attacks is approaching 1,300. As follows from UN daily reports, serious difficulties also continue on the humanitarian track. Israeli occupation and restrictions on the entry of aid and construction materials have trapped the Strip's 2 million inhabitants, and people are forced to crowd into less than 50% of the enclave's territory. Virtually every family faces a problem of finding shelter, while more than 70% of Palestinian children under the age of 2 consume unhealthy food. Other key provisions of the peace plan also remain on paper only, including the start of the actual functioning of the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza and the deployment in the Strip of the International Stabilization Force. It is also obvious that there is currently no talk of any practical steps related to the possible launch of reconstruction work in Gaza. Madam President, let's be factologically correct here. Over the past months, we have heard that progress on the aforementioned issues would become possible immediately after Hamas agreed to begin phased disarmament linked to the withdrawal of IDF units. But Israel has no intention of withdrawing IDF from Gaza. The critical nature of the principle of reciprocity was also mentioned by Mr. Mladenov in his May report to the Council. We note the efforts made by the High Representative of the Board of Peace to prepare the corresponding roadmap, to the implementation of which the Islamic movement responded with agreement, while the leadership of Israel publicly rejected it. We regret that some of those present in the Security Council chamber, for whatever reason, continue to remain silent about the real picture of what's happening around Gaza. Perhaps they should listen to the voices of reason from those countries, which are also members of the Board of Peace. They were also referred to today. Specifically, we refer to the latest statement by the foreign ministers of the Arab Muslim Group of 8 of 16th of August, who collectively condemned Israel's position and placed full responsibility on West Jerusalem for undermining efforts to improve the situation both in Gaza and in the rest of the OPT, specifically the West Bank. Public statements by prominent Israeli political figures, the plans and concrete steps of the country's government confirm the absence of any desire on the part of West Jerusalem to move towards de-escalation and implementation of the international legal basis for this settlement. Israel's ministers of national security and finance speak of the need to kill 30 to 40 Gazans every day and to secure the displacement of the enclave's residents with a view to re-establishing settlements there. At the same time, we note the negative developments on the situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. There, the Israeli authorities are consistently pursuing a policy of strengthening their administrative and legal control contrary to the provisions of Resolution 2334. The settlement activity of Netanyahu's government is breaking all records, and we're being regularly informed about this by Mr. Al-Akbarov. As another separate matter here is the E1 development plan, which was approved in 2025 and which will split Palestinian territories into two parts and will put paid to the territorial integrity of the state of Palestine. Along with many responsible countries, Russia condemns the provocative course of West Jerusalem and calls for an end to settlement activity, whether under the E1 project or in other parts of the occupied territory. Of no less concern is the fact that the policy of creating irreversible realities on the ground is accompanied by an unprecedented level of violence amongst Israeli settlers, increasing IDF raids in the West Bank, sweeping restrictions on the Palestinian movement, and violations of their rights of access to basic services. In this connection, we cannot fail to mention the West Jerusalem's destructive line towards UNRWA. UNRWA, which remains the backbone entity for providing comprehensive assistance both to residents of the OPT and the Palestinian refugees in countries of the region. And we call on Israeli authorities to fully comply with their obligations as the occupying power, to cease arbitrary raids of UNRWA facilities, in particular the training center in Kalandia, and overall to ensure the unimpeded work of UN personnel within the framework of their mandate. We are convinced that the agency's mission must continue until the final peaceful settlement of the conflict, entailing the establishment of an independent sovereign state of Palestine within the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, living side by side in peace and security with Israel. We have always held that a lasting peace and equal security can and must be achieved through the resumption of direct dialogue between the opposing parties on all outstanding contentious issues on the basis of extensive international legal framework and relying on the formula of 2 states for 2 peoples. Our country, as before, stands ready to engage with all constructive-minded partners in the interest of correcting a historic injustice and supporting the efforts of the peoples of the region themselves and their aspiration to build a prosperous Middle East free from crises. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Madam President, Liberia thanks Acting Special Coordinator Alakbarov, High Representative Malaknov, and Executive Director Rayburn for the insightful updates. We further welcome the participation of the representatives of Israel, Qatar, and the Observer State of Palestine. About 100 years ago, after our own independence, Liberia cast a vote in favor of UN General Assembly Resolution 181. We voted then, as we stand today, for a vision of 2 sovereign homes, an independent Arab state and a Jewish state, living side by side in peace, security, and mutual dignity. That commitment has never wavered. Yet, every day this Council's decisions go unimplemented. The space for peace contracts, civilian suffering deepens, and the legal authority of this institution is diminished. The fundamental question before us today is whether compliance with international law will remain optional. The advancement of tenders for 1,234 housing units in the E10 area, the E1 area, part of a broader plan for 3,401 units, 3,401 units, demands our urgent attention. This is not a routine administrative step. It directly threatens to sever the territorial contiguity and political viability of a future Palestinian state. With 19 October deadline approaching, the window for preventive action is narrowing. The legal baseline is clear. Resolution 2334 affirms that settlement built in occupied territories since 1967 have no legal validity. This obligation was further reinforced by the International Court of Justice in its July 2024 advisory opinion. In the spirit of constructive engagement, Liberia calls for a pause to the E1 tenders, a halt to settlement expansion, and decisive steps to prevent settler violence through accountability. Equal clarity must govern Gaza. Resolution 2803 outlines an agreed international architecture, a sustained ceasefire, full humanitarian access, transitional administration under the National Committee for Administration of Gaza, complete demilitarization, and a phased, verified withdrawal. There can be no selective compliance. Hamas and armed groups must fulfill their obligation to disarm, relinquish power, and defer to a single, unified civilian administration under the principle of one authority, one law, and one weapon. Israel must uphold the ceasefire, facilitate unhindered humanitarian access, cooperate with the International Verification Committee, and execute its withdrawal as agreed milestones are met. Having emerged from our own history of conflict, Liberia knows that human suffering cannot be held hostage to procedural delays. The access of civilians to water, shelter, and medical care is an absolute obligation under international humanitarian law. Security for Israel and self-determination for Palestine are not mutually exclusive. They are mutually dependent. Israeli security cannot be secured by perpetual occupation, nor can a viable Palestinian state exist as isolated enclaves. Liberia calls for 3 immediate actions: a pause on the E1 tenders and a halt to settlement expansion. The full, verified implementation of the Gaza transition framework by all parties. Council action to protect the physical conditions required for a 2-state solution. Sustainable peace in the Middle East crucially depends on the decisions of this Council to act while we can. Let us not fail to do so while we can. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Acting Special Coordinator Al-Akbarov, High Representative Mladenov, and Executive Director Rayburn. Madam President, last November, this Council adopted Resolution 2803, sending a powerful message of international support for President Trump's 20-point plan for Gaza. As we have heard from High Representative Mladenov, important progress has been made, which we welcome. But success relies on the actions of the parties themselves. First, all sides must fulfill the commitments they have made. The ceasefire must be respected. Israel must deliver her commitments made in the 20-point plan, including a phased withdrawal of the IDF from Gaza. Hamas must deliver on the commitment to decommission its weapons and terror infrastructure, and there must be a credible Palestinian-led transition of governance and security across the whole of the Gaza Strip. We encourage the Palestinian Authority to implement the reforms necessary to take on its responsibilities. Plans to hold legislative elections in November and national elections next year in Palestine are an important step, and they must be free, fair, and inclusive. Second, Resolution 2803 requires the full resumption of aid into Gaza and the rehabilitation of critical infrastructure. Yet the humanitarian situation remains dire. Averting starvation cannot be the benchmark. 59% of Gaza's population still faces crisis levels of food insecurity, or worse. 1.9 million Palestinians remain displaced, and fuel shortages are affecting hospitals and water and sanitation infrastructure. The government of Israel must end excessive aid restrictions, ensure that all aid, including fuel and engine oil, can enter predictably and at scale, open all crossings, and review the dual-use list to allow vital aid supplies in. And Hamas must stop obstructing humanitarian operations, as they did in July at a UN warehouse and food distribution point. This disrupted the delivery of life-saving assistance, with 2 truck drivers reportedly assaulted. The increasingly dangerous pattern of intimidation, violence, and obstruction, which puts humanitarian workers at risk, needs to end. The inviolability of UN premises must be respected. The forcible entry and reported seizure of UNRWA's Kalandia training center in Jerusalem yesterday is deeply concerning. The UN, including UNRWA and NGOs, should be able to operate safely and at scale in line with international humanitarian law. Accountability is essential where these standards are not met. It is right that the Israeli military will launch a criminal investigation into the killing of 5-year-old Hind Rajab, 6 of her family members, and 2 paramedics in Gaza in 2024. But the decision to bring no criminal action over the fatal strikes on a World Central Kitchen convoy in April 2024, which killed 7 staff members, including 3 British nationals, is unacceptable. Their families deserve justice, accountability, and answers from the government of Israel. Third, on the West Bank. UNSCR 2334 is clear that Israeli settlements in the West Bank are illegal. We call on the government of Israel to retract immediately construction tenders for the E1 settlement project. These unilateral plans take us further from peace. They will drive a wedge through the West Bank and isolate East Jerusalem and exacerbate instability. As Foreign Secretary Ed Miliband has said, we will not stand back and accept destruction of the two-state solution. We have also witnessed the tragic consequences of unprecedented levels of violence. The UN reports that 80 Palestinians and 3 Israelis have been killed in the West Bank this year. We are appalled by recent settler attacks in Taipei, the ongoing siege of homes in Kusra, and the killing of a 17-year-old in Sair. The government of Israel has said that addressing extremist violence is a priority. As Kusra has shown, the current approach is not working. More must be done to tackle settler violence and cease actions that enable it, and to ensure accountability. Restrictions on the Palestinian economy are also pushing it to a cliff edge, with over $6 billion in revenues withheld since May 2025, $5.8 billion trapped in banks, and correspondent banking services at risk. This threatens public services, the banking system, and the viability of the Palestinian Authority. Madam President, there is strong international support for full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2803. But the parties themselves must fulfill the commitments and refrain from actions that undermine peace. They must give Palestinians and Israelis the future they deserve, where a safe and secure Israel exists peacefully alongside a sovereign and viable Palestinian state comprising Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias. Thank you, Madam President. Panama is grateful for the briefings from the Acting Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov, as well as from the High Representative for Gaza, Mr. Nikolai Mladenov, and from the representative of the Association of International Development Agencies, Ms. Athena Rayburn. We also welcome the presence of the delegations of Israel and the Observer State of Palestine and Qatar at this meeting. The explanations provided to us by the briefers have given us a useful update about the realities on the ground in a resounding and at times dramatic way. And even though in some aspects it's interestingly contradictory in terms of its positive progress as well as its shortcomings, the light side and the dark side of those aspects. 45 days until we mark 1 year since the entry into force of the supposed ceasefire in Gaza on the 10th of October 2025, the reality on the ground continues to prove fragile. Since then, more than 1,280 Palestinians have lost their lives, and more than 4,100 have been injured. On average, that is equivalent to 4 Palestinians killed and 13 wounded every day. Panama insists on the importance of protecting the civilian population at all times in Gaza and calls upon all parties to show the greatest possible restraint, to refrain from any action that could endanger civilians, and to fully comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. The protection of the civilian population involves guaranteeing full, safe, sustained, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance at the required scale, which is essential for their survival. Access to water, food, medical care, and other essential services remains limited, and this in the midst of accumulated destruction, which is complicating the restoration of the minimum conditions for a decent life. To make it possible to improve these conditions, the protection of those providing that assistance must also be guaranteed. Humanitarian personnel must be able to do their jobs with security and independence without having to risk their lives to help the civilian population and without facing obstacles. This protection must, without exception, be extended to United Nations facilities. All parties must fully and at all times respect the inviolability of the facilities of the organization, as well as its privileges and immunities. This complex reality on the ground further highlights the urgent need for diplomatic progress and the need to seize upon the momentum generated in recent weeks in order to make the next phase of the peace agreement for Gaza possible, the agreement which was endorsed by Resolution 2803 of this Council. We once again urge the parties and the mediators to maintain and strengthen spaces for dialogue and, in good faith, to keep the commitments they have made, making efforts to make comprehensive progress in the implementation of the various different components of the agreement. The demilitarization of Gaza, the progressive withdrawal of Israeli forces, and legitimate security guarantees for Israel must be accompanied by reformed and unified Palestinian governance, which lays the groundwork for reconstruction and for the restoration of decent and secure living conditions for the Palestinian population in the entire Gaza Strip. This future of stability and recovery will not be possible without political will on the part of all of the parties involved in the conflict, which is needed in order to guarantee compliance with the commitments that have been taken on, respectively, including the intention expressed by Hamas to lead to its timely disarmament. Madam President, events in Gaza cannot be separated from the situation in the West Bank. Extended violence against Palestinian civilians, demolitions and displacements, as well as movement restrictions, continue to exacerbate tensions and weaken the prospects for a negotiated political solution. Of particular concern are decisions relating to Area E1 and other measures which continue to modify the situation on the ground because of their implications for the territorial continuity of the West Bank and the prospects for achieving a political solution. Panama reiterates its call for avoiding any unilateral measure which modifies the territorial or demographic reality on the ground, and recalls that the full implementation of the resolutions of this Council, in particular Resolution 2334 of 2016, remains essential in order to preserve the conditions needed for peace. Therefore, it is essential that the Palestinian Authority continue to move ahead with its process of reform and institutional strengthening. At the same time, it is necessary to avoid economic and financial measures which, on the contrary, would complicate that process and reduce the capacity of the Palestinian Authority to meet the needs of the population. Gaza and the West Bank form an integral part of the same territorial, political, and social reality. It is counterproductive to attempt to make progress in building a future for Gaza, while in the West Bank, the minimum conditions needed for achieving a solution are deteriorating. Panama will continue to support a negotiated political solution which will allow Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace, security, and dignity. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Madam President, the Democratic Republic of the Congo would like to thank the Special Coordinator, Mr. Alakbarov, the High Representative, Mr. Mladenov, and the Executive Director, Ms. Rayburn. We thank them for their briefings. Madam President, since our last meeting on this issue, developments in Gaza, in the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and in the wider region continue to receive our full attention. And they come at a time when diplomatic efforts in recent months are still seeking to consolidate the gains made and to preserve a sustainable political perspective. In Gaza, the Democratic Republic of the Congo reaffirms its full support for Resolution 2803 and to the comprehensive plan that it endorses. We welcome the efforts made by the High Representative for Gaza, by mediators and partners involved in its implementation, and encourage them to continue their efforts so that the current differences could be gradually resolved. The momentum created by the adoption of the resolution must now be translated into further progress. Several important issues remain unresolved, and progress is still limited. As time passes, it is important to maintain the momentum created by the plan and to maintain the conditions for seeking the conditions necessary for the compromises necessary for its implementation. In this context, the DRC encourages the parties to continue their exchanges and calls for renewed mobilization to preserve and consolidate the gains achieved through considerable efforts in the interest of the people of Gaza and, more broadly, the Palestinian and Israeli peoples who are called upon to live in peace and security. And in the same spirit, we reiterate the need to preserve the ceasefire. Despite its fragility, it remains essential for continued diplomatic efforts and the continuity of humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza. The Democratic Republic of the Congo urges all parties to work towards its consolidation. Madam President, the humanitarian situation in Gaza at the same time remains worrying. Despite the improvement in the delivery of aid since the ceasefire, the needs still remain considerable. In terms of access, only a few crossing points are functioning in a limited way so as to deliver aid. As a result, a significant part of the population continues to face difficulties in accessing food, healthcare, water, and other essential services. The Democratic Republic of the Congo stresses the importance of continuous, safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access in accordance with international humanitarian law. In this regard, the respect of the principle of accountability by all of the parties is a precondition for the consolidation of peace and security in that region. Regular and predictable access remains essential so as to enable humanitarian actors to maintain their operations and to meet the needs of populations over time. The humanitarian situation cannot be disassociated from the political and security environment in which this assistance is provided. In this regard, the consolidation of progress sought in the framework of Resolution 2803 must also make it possible, as was mentioned, to preserve the conditions necessary for a sustainable and effective humanitarian response. The progress made must be translated into concrete terms in the situation of civilian populations. Now, with regard to the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the Democratic Republic of the Congo reiterates its full support for Resolution 2334 and reiterates the importance of respecting its provisions. My delegation also reaffirms its support for the efforts made by the United Nations agencies and humanitarian organizations as they continue their mission in a particularly complicated operational environment. We are following with concern the continuation of the violence as well as other developments that could bring about lasting changes to the realities on the ground. The persistence of these trends comes at a time when diplomatic efforts in the region require, on the contrary, the preservation of the conditions for a sustainable political perspective. The Democratic Republic of the Congo reiterates a strong condemnation of all forms of violence against the civilian population, Palestinian and Israeli alike, as well as the attacks and acts of terrorism. My delegation deplores the consequences stemming from this. They contribute to further undermine the situation, and we call on all parties in the face of continued tensions to exercise restraint and to prioritize de-escalation. These developments cannot be seen in isolation from the ongoing efforts in Gaza. Resolution 2803 has made it possible to initiate a trend that must now be preserved and advanced. Developments in the West Bank are likely to complicate the political environment. And this is why our delegation believes it is essential that the efforts undertaken under Resolution 2803 should continue whilst ensuring that developments on the ground do not undermine the broader prospects for a political settlement. Mr. President, the situation is already fragile, and in addition to that, there are tensions in the region. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is following with concern the recent developments in Lebanon and calls for calm and restraints on the part of all parties. In the current context, it is important that these tensions do not impede the current diplomatic momentum or pave the way for further deterioration of the regional situation. In this regard, the DRC reaffirms its commitment to the sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence of Lebanon, and to respect for the relevant Security Council resolutions. My delegation in this context calls for responsibility on the part of all parties and all those who are in a position to contribute to the search for a political solution. The framework exists, is there, and considerable efforts have been made to bring positions closer together. The challenge now is to enable the efforts undertaken to produce new advances while preventing developments on the ground from gradually reducing the space opened up by diplomacy. Our support for Resolutions 2803 and 2334 stems from the same conviction to preserve the gains made, to promote continued efforts underway and to keep open the prospect of a lasting political settlement. Such a dynamic will have a real impact on the ground, not only in discouraging actions that continue to fuel fears of a full resumption of hostilities, but also in ensuring that the continuing risk of a real lapse into famine in Gaza and the West Bank is averted from a humanitarian viewpoint. And finally, and I will conclude with this, the Democratic Republic of the Congo reaffirms its readiness to work alongside the members of this Council and all of the partners concerned in favor of the continuation of diplomatic efforts and the rapprochement of positions in the interest of the peoples of the region and of peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Democratic Republic of Congo for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me thank the Acting Special Coordinator, Ramiz Alakbarov, and High Representative for Gaza to the Board of Peace, Nikolai Mladenov, for their briefings, as well as Ms. Athena Rayburn for her remarks. Mr. President, 9 months after the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2803, the necessity for a credible political horizon in Gaza remains urgent as ever. The commitments undertaken under the Comprehensive Peace Plan must now be translated into concrete action on the ground. Greece welcomes the progress achieved so far, including the release of all hostages, the scaling up of humanitarian assistance, and Israel's approval of the entry of the ISF into Gaza. Most importantly, it is imperative that all parties maintain the current talks, which are essential to advance the implementation of the plan and build on the progress achieved so far. At the same time, urgent further steps are needed to address the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Despite the relative improvement in conditions, thousands of civilians continue to be affected by water insecurity, severe pressure on the health system, malnutrition, inadequate shelter, all amid extreme summer temperatures and drought conditions. Humanitarian and commercial flows must be sustained, made predictable, and further increased. In this vein, the role of humanitarian actors, including UNRWA, remains indispensable. In this regard, we are concerned with the incursion into the United Nations Kalandia Training Center. We reaffirm that the integrity and inviolability of United Nations premises must be respected, upheld, and protected. Early recovery must move forward in parallel with the ongoing political and security discussions. Momentum should be maintained on projects addressing immediate social and economic needs, while ensuring that transitional arrangements strengthen rather than replace Palestinian institutions. The disarmament of Hamas and of other armed factions is also a priority. The terror groups are an impediment to peace and to the realization of the aspirations of the Palestinian peoples. Hamas cannot have a role in the governance of Gaza. We commend the efforts of the High Representative Mladenov on accelerating the discussions on disarmament as addressing Israel's legitimate security concerns is a necessary condition of peace, for peace. We encourage the necessary arrangements for the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza to enter the Strip and assume its responsibilities as soon as possible, so as to implement the crucial plans on housing and restoration of basic services. We also support the deployment of the newly vetted Palestinian police forces. We believe that the roles of NCAG and the Palestinian Authority are complementary. We will continue supporting the Palestinian Authority in its path for reforms. The ultimate objective should be the return of a reformed and effective Palestinian Authority to Gaza as soon as possible in accordance to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2803. At the same time, we should collectively continue engaging with Israel on the release of withheld Palestinian tax revenues, which are critical to the financial stability of the Palestinian Authority and its reform efforts. Madam President, the situation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem remains deeply concerning. Settlement expansion, forced displacement, demolitions, and settler violence, including against Christian communities, threaten to fundamentally alter the realities on the ground. We are strongly concerned with the recent tendering for the construction of housing units in the E1 settlement, as such actions run counter to international law and undermine the prospects for a negotiated two-state solution. Inflammatory rhetoric and provocative statements are similarly counterproductive. In this context, consistent investigations, follow-up, and implementation of relevant decisions remain essential. It is of paramount importance the preservation and respect of the historic and legal status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem, an essential element of interfaith coexistence and regional stability. In concluding, Madam President, Greece will continue to support all efforts aimed at reinvigorating a credible political process leading to a negotiated two-state solution in line with all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions and the New York Declaration. International initiatives, including the recent meeting of the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution in Rome, provide further impetus to advance the political process and contribute to implementing the commitments undertaken. Greece will remain committed to working to turn the present opening into lasting progress towards sustainable peace and stability in Gaza and the West Bank. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Madam President, I thank Acting Special Coordinator Al-Akbarov and High Representative Mladenov for their briefing. I also listened carefully to Ms. Rayburn's IDA Director remarks, which underscore the urgent realities facing Palestinians and humanitarian actors in the occupied Palestinian territory, as well as the dangerous humanitarian disconnection in the implementation of Resolution 2803. Somalia wishes to underscore the following key points. First, the situation in Gaza remains deeply alarming and requires sustained attention. The humanitarian crisis is acute. Nearly 2 million individuals, about 94% of Gaza's population, now require shelter or basic household assistance, while water insecurity affects the vast majority of residents. As we have heard, humanitarian access remains severely restricted and the needs on the ground are immense. Somalia reiterates its call for the full, immediate, and faithful implementation of Security Council Resolution 2803 with tangible improvements for Palestinian civilians, including unimpeded humanitarian access, reconstruction, and the advancement of credible political process toward peace. We note the recent agreement on the 15-point roadmap with Hamas for Gaza's next phase, which outlines steps for disarmament and Israeli withdrawal. While this development is significant, Somalia is concerned by the lack of progress in the implementation, in particular, ongoing ambiguity in timelines and lack of clarity regarding the sequencing of commitments under Resolution 2803, which could entrench the long-standing occupation of Palestinian territories. We note with regret the posture of the Israeli occupation in their rejection of this roadmap and its unwillingness to proceed at this stage. This has direct implication on the ceasefire and accountability for the situation on the ground. Of the 150 cases of troops conduct in Gaza reviewed by Israel, the occupying force, only 2 have resulted in criminal referrals, further eroding confidence in the accountability process. The Council must insist that Israel, the occupying power, provide clarity, transparency, and genuine engagement to agreed steps in order to create the conditions necessary for peace and stability. Second, Somalia emphasizes that humanitarian aid is a legal and moral imperative and must not be politicized. It should be removed from security prerequisites like disarmament verification in the implementation of Resolution 2803. All border crossings must remain open to ensure the rapid and safe delivery of essential supplies, including fuel, medicine, food, and water. Gaza's healthcare system is at risk of collapse, with thousands in need of specialized care and urgent evacuation, while medical facilities are overwhelmed or destroyed. The restoration of medical corridors to the West Bank should also be immediate, and the efforts to rebuild Gaza's healthcare infrastructure are essential. Somalia rejects collective punishment in all its forms. Civilians, especially women and children, must never bear the consequences of political or military decisions. Third, developments in the West Bank and East Jerusalem remains a source of grave concern. In August, the announcement of tenders of 1,234 new housing units in the E1 area threatens to further fragment the West Bank and undermine the prospects for a viable Palestinian state. Today, it's evident that the trajectory of Israeli policy is shifting its long-standing annexation from a de facto to a de jure reality. These recent legislative and administrative changes, transferring key authorities from military to civilian Israeli control in the West Bank, are clear steps in this direction. In that regard, Somalia condemns these actions and reaffirms that all Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, are illegal and in contravention of Security Council Resolution 2334. We call directly on Israel, the occupying power, to reverse these measures, which exacerbate tensions and undermine the pursuit of a just peace. While recent indictment of settlers for a deadly attack is a rare step toward accountability, such measures remain insufficient. Fourth, the protection of civilians and the safeguarding of humanitarian operations must remain central to the Council's effort. The challenges faced by Palestinians across the occupied Palestinian territory are profound. Since last October's ceasefire, over 1,250 Palestinians have been killed and more than 4,000 injured in Gaza alone. In the West Bank and East Jerusalem in 2026, sexual violence has resulted in 70 Palestinian deaths, including 18 children, and over 1,500 incidents have been recorded affecting hundreds of communities. Somalia is also deeply concerned by the restrictions impacting UNRWA's ability to fulfill its mandate. UNRWA remains an indispensable provider of services to millions of Palestinian refugees and must be protected and supported. Therefore, we join the Secretary General in strongly condemning the recent unauthorized entries by Israeli authorities into UNRWA premises in the Kalandia Training Center, which is the fifth instance of unauthorized entry by the Israeli authorities into the center since May. It's imperative that the UN premises are respected and that the humanitarian and UN staff are able to operate safely with their privileges and immunities fully upheld. Lastly, Madam President, the multifaceted challenges before us cannot be addressed solely through the humanitarian lens, which is under severe restriction today. A durable political solution is in addressing the long-standing root cause of occupation is indispensable. The faithful and the full immediate implementation of Resolution 2803 and 2334 must be prioritized. The unity and territorial integrity of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, must be preserved. Somalia is particularly concerned by the withholding of $6 billion of Palestinian Authority tax revenues and banking restrictions, which threaten Palestinian governance and exacerbate the humanitarian crisis. Somalia reaffirms its unwavering support for the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and the establishment of an independent, sovereign, and contiguous state of Palestine based on pre-1967 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia as for the statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Denmark. And let me also start by thanking Acting Special Coordinator Alec Barov, High Representative Mladenov, and Ms. Rayburn for their important briefings. Colleagues, today we take stock of the implementation of Resolution 2803, 9 months after its adoption. High Representative Mladenov asked this Council to say plainly and repeatedly what this Council has already decided, and plainly said, despite the continuous efforts of the Board of Peace and regional mediators, we must face the facts. We have not seen the progress we had hoped for and promised 9 months ago. Resolution 2803 sets out several important requirements: the disarmament of Hamas, the deployment of the International Stabilization Force, the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza assuming its responsibilities in Gaza, and the phased withdrawal of IDF from Gaza. We welcome the progress made towards a disarmament agreement and call on all parties to embrace it and commit to it in good faith. Resolution 2803 and the 20-point plan also call for full humanitarian access, including the rehabilitation of infrastructure. Yet, severe restrictions persist. Civilians in Gaza continue to live in appalling conditions. Many live in tents, exposed to the elements, without sanitation, clean water, or sufficient food. This leaves them dangerously vulnerable to disease. Hundreds of thousands of children remain out of school, denying them not just an education today, but years of opportunity in the future. The 20-point plan specifically required the rehabilitation of hospitals. However, we continue to hear reports that there has been little to no improvement in the healthcare situations since the ceasefire. Most hospitals in Gaza are fully or partially destroyed, and medical care is taking place in makeshift facilities or tents. Despite the ceasefire, no health facility in the Gaza Strip has been rehabilitated to full functionality. Therefore, Denmark again calls for the medical corridor between Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, to be reopened. We also, once again, call for the lifting of all restriction of humanitarian aid in line with international humanitarian law. This includes the unreasonable restrictions on dual-use items. As we heard today from Ms. Rayburn, international NGOs play a crucial role in humanitarian aid operations in Gaza. They should be allowed to operate. Colleagues, allow me to return to the West Bank, where the situation has deteriorated even further since our last meeting just 2 weeks ago. The acting special coordinator has described the situation in detail, and we've all seen the images of settlers terrorizing Palestinian communities. Such acts of violence should be adequately addressed and accountability ensured. As discussed in our last meeting, settlements continue to expand. With tenders issued last week for the E1 settlement project, de facto annexation has moved one step closer. As Foreign Minister Løkke Rasmussen has stated, this tender is a destructive move by the Israeli government, undermining the two-state solution. Denmark again calls for the immediate halt of the E1 plans and underscore that settlements are a flagrant breach of international law. Economically, Palestinian life in the West Bank is suffocating in an ever tighter chokehold. Israel's continuing withholding of tax revenues is driving the Palestinian Authority's debt even deeper and undermining its capacity to deliver services as well as the necessary reforms. And finally, many today have mentioned Israel's latest unauthorized seizure of UNRWA's Kalandia facility in East Jerusalem yesterday. Also, this is unacceptable. We urge Israel to abide by its international obligations to ensure the protection and inviolability of UN premises. Denmark fully supports UNRWA's indispensable mission. In closing, it has been said many times in this chamber, but it bears repeating today. Gaza and the West Bank are two parts of the same story and two integral parts of a future Palestinian state. We cannot address one while allowing the other to deteriorate. We all see the trends clearly. If we continue down this trajectory, we will very soon be in a situation where the two-state solution we all committed to will no longer be a possibility, and where steps towards a de facto annexation will be irreversible. Lasting peace can only be achieved through a two-state solution, most recently reaffirmed in the New York Declaration. Denmark will continue to work to support its full realization for both Palestinians and Israelis alike. And I resume my function as President of the Council and now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine. I thank the representative of Israel for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Qatar.
President, at the outset, allow me to thank you for convening this meeting to continue the Council's consideration of this important item. We thank the briefers, and I am pleased to deliver the statement on behalf of the Arab Group. The Arab Group once again stresses that the Palestinian question remains critical for peace in the Middle East, and that just, comprehensive and durable peace cannot be achieved without ending Israeli occupation and upholding the legitimate and inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, namely the right to self-determination and an independent and sovereign state along the 4th of June 1967 lines, with East Jerusalem as its capital. In this regard, we welcome growing international recognition of the State of Palestine and its reaffirming of the importance of the New York Declaration and the recognition of the important efforts of the Global Alliance for the implementation of the two-state solution. We strongly condemn the ongoing gross Israeli violations across the OPT, including the targeting of civilians, settlement expansion, seizure of land, demolition of homes, forced displacement, and terrorization of civilians. We unequivocally reject all measures aimed at entrenching Israeli occupation or imposing the Israeli sovereignty over any part of the OPT. These measures are null and void and have no legal effect. They constitute a blatant violation of international law and relevant Security Council resolutions, namely 2334. Madam President, as for the situation in the Gaza Strip, the Arab Group condemns the declared Israeli rejection of the roadmap to implement President Trump's comprehensive plan to end the conflict in Gaza, endorsed by Security Council Resolution 2803, as well as the Israeli rejection of the establishment of the Palestinian state. This is a direct rejection of the comprehensive plan, jeopardizing its implementation and fundamentally undermining collective efforts to achieve just and durable peace. The roadmap, which was accepted by Palestinian factions, is the culmination of efforts made by the mediators, the State of Qatar, the Arab Republic of Egypt, the Republic of Turkey, the United States, the High Representative for Gaza, and the Board of Peace. It is an important milestone to restrict control over weapons in parallel with IDF withdrawal, deployment of ISF, and the transferring of administrative governance to the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, the reconstruction of the Strip as provided for in the comprehensive plan. We stress the urgent need for the full implementation of the comprehensive plan to address the dangerous humanitarian situation, foster security and stability for all in the Gaza Strip, pave the way for safe, sustainable, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance across the Strip, and achieving a just and durable peace to uphold the right to self-determination for the Palestinian people. As for the situation in the occupied West Bank, we condemn the dangerous escalation therein, including the escalation of settler violence against Palestinian civilians, which led to an unprecedented toll of innocent deaths, including amongst children. This year, we call upon the international community to compel Israel to halt these illegal practices and ensure accountability of the perpetrators. We condemn illegal Israeli settlement expansions, and we fully reject the E1 settlement plan, including relevant settlement activities to the east of the occupied East Jerusalem. This is a blatant violation of international law, including Resolution 2334 and the advisory opinion of the ICJ. We call upon the international community to shoulder its responsibilities, implement international law, including relevant Security Council resolutions, and put these violations to a halt. We stress that the OPT is one political and geographic indivisible unit, and we stress the vital role of the Palestinian Authority. We condemn the weakening of the Palestinian banking sector and the withholding of clearance revenues. We condemn Israeli measures aimed at altering the Arab and Christian Muslim identity, as well as the demographic and legal status of occupied Jerusalem, in a blatant violation of international law and Israel's commitments as the occupying power. We welcome the ministerial meeting convened to support Jerusalem and its holy sites, held in Jordan early this month, and the subsequent common positions, reiterating the centrality of the question of Jerusalem and Palestine, and condemnation of violations against Al-Haram al-Sharif and attempts to alter its historic and legal status quo. As well as the positions that have stressed the historic Hashemite custodianship over holy sites in Jerusalem and the need for concerted international action to end Israeli illegitimate escalatory measures. We stress the indispensable role of UNRWA. The international community must undertake all necessary measures to ensure the fulfillment of its mandate. We condemn all Israeli violations against UNRWA, including the evacuation and forcible entry into Kalandia Training Center, and blatant violation of international law and the immunity and privileges of the United Nations, as well as the ICJ advisory opinion. I thank you.
Statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.